Hey everyone, Doug here. Before this episode really gets rolling, I just want to say something really quick here, as it is time sensitive and specifically time sensitive to June of 2024. If it's not June of 2024, go ahead and skip couple of seconds into the future and then you'll get to the actual episode. But for now, if you're listening to this in June of 2024, when this episode is released, I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be making a public appearance, my very first public appearance. I've been doing this podcast for 5 years. This month specifically is my 5-year anniversary on the 10th of June. And so I've decided, you know what, let's take the podcast into the public sphere. So if you live in London, England, and you would like to see me talk, I'm going to be doing a small soiree at the greatest bookstore in the world, occult or otherwise, by the name of Treadwell's in the Bloomsbury area of central London. So yes, if you think that you want to come and see me and you got some money to spare, that's only £10, come and see me on Thursday, the 20th of June at Treadwell's. It's going to be from 7 o'clock in the evening to about 9:30. That's British Summertime or BST. I would love to see you there. Again, only £10. We're going to have a talk. Christina is going to talk to me. That's the owner of Treadwell's, is going to be talking to me about grimoire magic and kind of how I became somebody who would pull a lot of my magic from the grimoires or those books of magic that we have historically around museums across the world. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my journey and why I think grimoires are a really good place to pull your magic from, and just how changeable and mutable and adaptable they can be. It's going to be a wonderful time. So there'll be me sitting down, talking with Christina. There's going to be a Q&A. And then afterwards, if you're feeling up to it, you can have a glass of wine and you can shake my hand. I might be able to sign something to yours if you really want. I've never done this before, so this is going to be the very first time that I'm doing anything like it. Again, if you live in London or you live in the area and you feel like taking a train or a plane or anything of that variety to come and see me, then please do. Tickets are available as of the point when this episode is released, but they might go pretty fast. So come on down to see me at Treadwell's Bookshop. That is Thursday, 20th of June, 2024 at Treadwell's Bookstore. I can't wait to see you there. It's going to be a wonderful time. And yes, hopefully there'll be a few more of these public appearances of mine in the not too distant future. But for now, this is the only one I got. So with that, it is time to do the episode. Cue the shitty 90s infomercial music. Hello, everyone. Welcome to What Magic Is This, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor. My goodness, we have a fantastic show for everybody. But before we get talking about what we be talking about this episode, I would just like to bring up how this episode came about. Now, there's a couple of things that occurred. There's been some things happening in my life just requiring my attention and taking me a little bit away from the podcast for a little bit. And so I wanted to do something that was really quite fun and really different, and to look into something that would bring me joy and happiness and look back at a period of time that was an interesting period of time. But the reason I am talking with my guest today is that my guest was just one of those things where I had to have them on the show for a couple of reasons. The first one was that they came to my attention by basically sending me a very beautiful portrait of myself. And if you go to my Instagram page and you scroll down a bit, you can see this wonderful, beautiful black and white sideways profile picture illustration of myself surrounded by these wonderful Greek gods. It's just the most wonderful thing. So that's how I got to meet this wonderful person, and dare I say friend. But also the real reason that they're definitely on this show is the fact that they were the only one to get my UFO music mystery. And so at the end of my episode on UFOs that I did in February of 2024, I asked people, there's this background music at the end of the episode, and if anybody can guess it, they win a special prize. And my guest today was the only one to guess it. And the solution to that mystery was, go ahead, Brian. What was going on with that music selection?
Like I told you prior to us, starting this recording, I admit that I did use Shazam.
Shazam!
I
Nice.
was able to get it at the very last 2 seconds of the clip where you'd stop talking. Um, but if I remember correctly, um, the I did have to do the research and find the connection as to why you used it. But if I remember correctly, the connection was um, it was released at it was like the number one hit at the same time that the Roswell crash happened.
Roswell, as well as the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947. Yes. So the song is called "Pego My Heart" by Jerry Murad and the Harmonicats. And yeah, it was not just like number one in the charts. It was like number one on jukeboxes, on the radio. It was a smash hit, and that is indeed the reason that I put it there. And Brian sent me a message over Instagram, and he absolutely nailed it. I had about 8 people reach out to me trying to solve it, and none of them got it. And you were the only one who did. So it's like, bang! All right, you're on the podcast now. But there's another reason that you're on the podcast is because you are a graphic designer, an illustrator, very beautiful artist, and you just released a wonderful fanzine about the paranormal and the supernatural and
Mhm.
UFOs, and it's called Ufology. And I was very delighted to be able to read it and go through it. And I thought it was just wonderful. But at the very beginning of this magazine, you talk about and defend the idea of nostalgia, of this sentiment of looking back at your past, and basically saying, you know what, this is not useless. This is not childish. This is a
Mhm.
noble thing to do. So I'd like if you'd be kind enough to just basically say why you think nostalgia is a healthy thing.
It can I think it can be a toxic impulse as I think that's something that John Hodgman says all the time. And I remember kind of hearing him say that a lot listening to his podcast and his work. And it was kind of something that always bugged me because nostalgia is something that it helped me as a child in the environment that I grew up in. Um, without going into a lot of detail or getting really sappy or you know, just giving away too much information. I grew up in a home that was kind of emotionally neglectful and very abusive at times, and so I escaped into things like the X Files and Star Trek and Art Bell, and I I remember being in third grade and coming up with this great alien character who was like a swashbuckling space pirate, and I imagined that he was my real father. Um, and I dreamed of going to school with like the X-Men and stuff, and I definitely escaped into these other worlds. Um, and as an adult, as I went to therapy and kind of learned how to process all these experiences and kind of reparent myself and love myself, um, nostalgia and kind of revisiting a lot of these things was a way to kind of go back and see not how I escaped into them and kind of ignored these problems, which is something you can, definitely do. But it was a way to kind of recognize how they helped create who I am today. The person that I am today, and even growing up in a very kind of Christian fundamental conservative household, and I started to kind of deconstruct that and not be a part of that world anymore. You know, going back and visiting, you know, the next Star Trek, the Next Generation, and kind of that kind of socialist utopia with love and acceptance for everybody no matter your faith or alien race or whatever was kind of really helped in that transition from you know becoming somebody who is more loving and accepting of others and especially of myself. And Virginia, my fiance, did a lot to help me write that intro. I'd say that intro is just as much hers as it is mine. And we were having a conversation about this last night and talking about nostalgia and what it means. And she was saying, for her and what it means for her is to also kind of go back and revisit these things in the past and then bring back to the present, the little parts of it that still matter.
Definitely. Very well put, Brian. And that's what the subject of this episode is indeed we're looking back and seeing the decade that I would say shaped me fundamentally. So, for today on What Magic Is This podcast, we will be looking at the weird 90s from A, Art Bell, to Z, Zapruder film, or Z, as they say in the United States. So, thank you so much for joining me here, Brian. Man, I cannot wait to get into it. So, do you remember very much about the early 90s? So, we had the kind of it was I was quite young. I was about 7 years old when it happened, but I do remember just the newspapers and everything at the time talking about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The
Hmm.
wall came down in the 80s, and then everything that happened afterwards, just that this enemy, this adversary almost in a way. I mean, things were a little bit tame by the time the Soviet Union fell apart, but for the longest time, the Soviet Union was considered the great adversary of the West, of freedom and all of those kind of ideals that while I was too young to even know what they stood for, I knew that this was a momentous occasion. But then something else happened that was pretty big as well, and that was the first Gulf War. It's crazy that I have to
Hmm.
say the
Hmm.
first Gulf War, but we do the first Gulf War, in which Saddam Hussein was using weapons on certain people, and the invasion of Kuwait, and
Hmm.
all of that stuff, as well as within the UK. And this was not even on my radar, but just the eruption of the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher in Britain. Um, I will say this though, Brian, is that and this is something that the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the Gulf War, was instrumental in. Is something that is instrumental to this entire decade, and that is the use of video and the complete eruption and essential nature of the recorded image on things like video, and the fact that we could record things at home and then pass them to other people. That was one of the biggest aspects of the 90s, and particularly with something like the Gulf War. The coverage of the Gulf War specifically is just one of those things that it really, in a way, kicked off the attitude of the 90s, of just how big the image is going to be for this, not just this decade, the 90s, but going forward. You have something to say about the Gulf War. That was this. I kind of remember this, but can you share what you wrote? Because I do a Google document for most episodes, and I like to collaborate with my guests.
Hmm.
And you brought this up, and I was like, oh, I forgot that this was actually a thing. It was less so where I was, but I've seen them.
Yeah, it's yeah, I was a military brat. My dad was in the Coast Guard and served in the Coast Guard all the way up until my junior year of high school is when he retired in 2002. I graduated in 2003. So kind of my, entire young adult life, is kind of living on bases and in that universe. And my dad collected trading cards. They were huge in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating because here I am reading the X-Men comics and he's buying and collecting Jim Lee trading cards of the X-Men and doesn't even know who they are, and like not letting me look at them. But he also collected Tops had made like a trading card set of Desert Storm.
So like
And
all of the weapons
all of the weapons, the tanks, the planes, you had
and
like
warthogs, right?
you they had like literally like a card of fucking Dick Cheney.
Are you serious?
Yeah, like Dick Cheney and the president, and I'm probably the vice president, and Powell, and just like it's really bizarre how in America, they tend to kind of like, and I had mentioned this and the Google Doc that, for me and kind of being in that kind of environment, again, this kind of pro-military, very conservative environment, for us, it was like watching Michael Jordan and the Dream Team go to the Olympics and kind of like, just destroy their
Destroy
opponents and
everyone.
like, and I'm sure, and a lot of people kind of view those things like that now. And it's, I don't think it's like that, it's not at all like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just very bizarre to take something like war and
That childish
and
impulse.
kind of like the American imperialism and stuff, and kind of just like celebrate it in that way is like, here's some cool trading cards with Dick Cheney on it. Like,
Yeah, all of the weapons would have their own cards and stuff like that, A-10 warthogs, and just it's incredible. I did see I had to look it up, and some of these cards were really familiar. They had, like, these weird red backgrounds and the colors of the American flag on them, and it's just like,
mhm.
"Oh, could not do that, can't do that now," but that's really crazy that that happened. And yeah, because that's kind of the way that the 90s kicked off, at least within, I'm going to say, North America. For the most part, it was a North American endeavor, but I'm going to talk about a couple of things that definitely had ramifications within the 90s. And the first one is that it was fully active in the 90s, but it had taken a different turn by the turn of the 80s to the 90s, which was the Satanic Panic. And I'm not going to dwell on it too much, as I will most likely be doing an episode on the Satanic Panic a little bit further on up the line. But it really hung over this entire decade like a terrible miasma. It was on talk shows. It was through
Mhm.
everything. This was the period of time from like the late 80s where they were starting to do way more hypnosis and regressive hypnosis to get people talking about the bad things that had happened to them, and the things that people were saying were being taken really literally by certain segments, but then not just in America, but also in the UK and also in Canada. It was a whole thing. And you remember the Satanic Panic, do you not?
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's,
um
it's crazy. It's just
yeah, I mean, it's not to beat a dead horse, but especially, with the environment that I grew up in, because I was on the other side of that. I was on the accusatory side of that.
really.
Um, and not that I did any of the accusing, but I was afraid of it because I was in that Christian environment that was also afraid of those things.
Right.
Um, and for me, kind of the extent of it was like, I was born in '84, so I didn't experience much of it in like the '80s, but the '90s and early '90s especially, like, kids in the '80s, had issues with like Dungeons and Dragons, and me in the '90s, I wasn't allowed to watch certain shows. I had to go to a friend's house to watch X-Files.
Wow.
Um and I especially, was not allowed to play Magic the Gathering, which was huge in the early '90s.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a big thing for sure.
And that was definitely kind of an extension of like the Satanic Panic kind of trickling into my household. And
Interesting. Yeah, it's weird that we're going to touch on this a little bit later on towards the end of the episode, but just the return of the Satanic Panic kind of stuff that we're going through now. It's just
Mhm.
it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's just you cannot keep the Satanic Panic down. Another thing that was really big towards the end of the 80s was that Whitley Strieber released a book called Communion, in which it was his experiences with certain contact with entities. And everybody, I've talked about it before on my UFO episode and elsewhere. Um, as big as the book was, and then they later produced a movie, I believe, in 1989, starring Christopher Walken. Uh, this book, while it did spend 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list at number one, when it was put into paperback, it was one of those things where the cover of a gray alien, like, it was seared into my brain. And
Mhm.
I remember very distinctly in the early 90s going to the checkout lines or lanes of grocery stores, and Communion would be there. It would like be right beside like the Daniel Steele and things like that, and the Stephen King novels. There'd be Whitley Strieber's Communion. And so this idea of people being contacted and abducted by aliens it was part of what was going on as the 80s rolled into the 90s. So
Mhm.
it was big. It was huge for sure. Something that was a little bit under the radar, although he became a much bigger figure within the 90s, was the Bob Lazar tapes. For people who don't
Mhm.
know, Bob Lazar was he claimed that he was an employee at, I believe it was like the Groom Lake, United States Air Force military base known as Area 51. He was under the apprehension, or he claims, and to this day, he still claims the same thing, that he has seen. There was technology at Area 51 that was recovered from crashed UFOs and crashed aliens, and that the United States government has access to anti gravity devices. He's got absolutely everything. He appeared in an interview with his face blurred. He hadn't gone completely public, but with his face blurred and his voice modified, I believe. And he was talking to in 1989 with George Knapp, who is somebody who is still around to this day. So what that does, in a way, is it it reaches full fruition within the 90s, but it takes this idea of aliens and UFOs and government intervention and
Mhm.
and secrecy, and it turns the dial up quite a bit there. And also what occurred in the 90s or the 80s was there was a book called The Roswell Incident, which put eyes back on what occurred at Roswell, New Mexico. For folks who don't know, and I really hope if you're listening to my podcast, you know about Roswell. But there was in 1947, apparently and allegedly, a UFO crash in Roswell, New Mexico. It's a huge thing still to this day. But all of these things, all of these small things, were kind of bubbling under the surface in the late 80s. And in my opinion, though, in my opinion, the weird 90s truly begins with the release of Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK and the fallout of interest in it. Brian, did you have a chance to watch JFK before we did this?
No, I haven't, yeah.
Oh my gosh. You don't have 3 hours to spare to watch the director's cut? Man, it was one of those things where I didn't get to watch it in 1991. I watched it, I think, when I was 10 years old. So a couple of years. I watched it in like 93 or 94. And it was a big thing. But what JFK was a film that goes through the fallout of events from the assassination of the president of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in Dallas, in Dealey Plaza there, back in, I believe, 1963 in November. I believe it was November 22nd, 1963, if my memory recalls. The main character is played by Kevin Costner, which is Jim Garrison, who was a district attorney in New Orleans, Louisiana, who prosecuted some people that he felt were part of a conspiracy to kill the president of the United States. Of course, the official record was that this communist lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president. And this film basically says, no, he didn't. And it put out a bunch of characters. It's one of those things where if you've never seen JFK and you know very little about it, go to the Internet Movie Database and look who is in this film. It's crazy who's in this movie. I'm not going to spoil it, but besides Kevin Costner, the amount of stars in this movie,
Mhm.
it's insane. But it was a huge phenomenon. So before this film came out, we had the idea of conspiracies within the American government was one of those things where Watergate had, of course, occurred back in the 70s, but also you had Iran Contra and a bunch of political upheavals in which people basically suspected not just like I'll just write what I've written, that America no longer simply suspected that the government was undermining democracy. They were certain that it was guilty of much worse, and that the United States conspiracy was just the order of the day. It was all that alphabet agencies like the CIA and the FBI was complicit. Everybody was complicit in these things, and they were just doing really bad stuff. And even before the film JFK, there was a situation in which a journalist by the name of Danny Casolaro, whose name is starting to come up yet again due to a documentary that was released on Netflix a few months ago called American Conspiracy: The Octopus, in which it talks about this incredible journalist who was found dead in a hotel room, and they said it was suicide. But if you look at any of the events as to or how he was found dead, it looks like murder. It looks like he was killed.
Mhm.
But he was uncovering something. He just started reading into one story about this software called Promise. And it spiraled from that, in which he thought that there was this giant conspiracy, this at least America, if not worldwide conspiracy that he called the octopus. But let's focus on this one thing, because you wrote a little note here about the software itself called Promise. What can you tell the listeners about this software, Brian?
Basically, if I remember correctly, it's it was basically a database used um well, to track like cases, to,
Crime. Yeah.
crime, those involved, you know, I'm sure, documents interactions between lawyers and clients and all sorts of stuff. And the guy who developed it had developed it while he had a job working, I think, with the American government. There were issues there where, they basically claimed ownership of it because he created it while working for the American government. And there was, kind of lawsuits and issues there. And eventually, I think these computers were sold off and auctioned off as just like, old hardware no longer needed, and that was allegedly purchased by a guy named Charles Hayes, and he found this software on there and was using it to blackmail politicians and all sorts of other people, and it just turned into a big giant mess, as well as I think the guy who developed the software had put a back door in it so that he also could spy on those who were using it.
They sold it to the country where I live. They sold it to Canada, and they were using it as a backdoor to spy on Canada. It became a tool of espionage. Like the US was like, here, have this thing, Canada. And Canada's like, thanks. And then it was just the US was just able to use it to look into things that was happening through the RCMP and CSIS. And it was so insane. It's just such a crazy thing.
Mhm.
This journalist was looking into it, and he just kept finding more and more conspiracies. And then in 1991, in August, I believe, he was found dead. And before he was killed, he was telling everybody, if I die, it's not because I died or took my own life, or I don't have a disease. I'm healthy. It's somebody's trying to kill me. And he was very
Mhm.
agitated right before he was found with huge trigger warning. This is really violent. The gashes in his arms. I've seen the first two episodes of the new documentary, and while I thought I had seen photos of his wounds, they're it's really gruesome. Like, it's very messed up. Like, I don't know. I don't know if anybody in their right mind and or how people that suicidal would be able to do something like that. It's really quite crazy. He had other wounds as well that looked like he was held down, and it's
Mhm.
really messed up. But he was a it was a big story in 1991. The death of Danny Castellero. People were going like, "There's something fishy here." It caught a lot more. It took on a bit more traction a bit later on down the line, but that was in the waters here as well. But I want to talk a little bit about the film JFK, because that came out towards the end of the year in 1991, and it was explosive. It caused a whole bunch of things. There was it reinvigorated something called the Assassination Record Review Board, and it also started this thing called the JFK Act, in which there was going to be it forced the American government to release records as to papers that were taken at the time of the investigation of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I believe in 2017, they just had a bunch of documents released, but they still held on to a couple more. So we have to wait even more years for even more of these papers that were taken and these documents from the time to come out. Hugely controversial. Everybody just jumping on board, saying that Oliver Stone is a hack, that he's just fueling already high tempers and engagement in conspiracy theories. It was a whole thing, and my I will always, it's one of those things that I will remember for the rest of my life. The very first time I watched JFK was actually the very first time I saw something that was called the Zapruder film, and that is the only known film footage that we have, taken by a gentleman by the name of Abraham Zapruder, taken of President Kennedy as he's getting shot with bullets, supposedly from behind. And one of the very last moments of the Zapruder film is the shot that killed John F. Kennedy, in which, and this is in the movie, in which his head goes back into the left as if a bullet came from the front. Although a lot of people have said that there's evidence to say that when a bullet goes through you, it does certain things where it makes your head look like it's going back. I don't buy it too much, my personally, but I just remember seeing that for the first time, and I stopped the tape. I was watching it, and I had like a little meltdown. Like it was upsetting, and he wasn't even my president, but it was just
Mhm.
like, holy shit! Like, how can anybody look at that and just be like, yeah, one guy did that? Like it was unreal to me. Have you seen the Zapruder film?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's hard to watch.
It is hard to watch, and Jacqueline Kennedy jumping into the back to try and you don't know what she's doing, but you later find out that the wife of John F. Kennedy is going to the back because part of his skull has blown off, and she's literally trying to again, trigger warning for people, violence. It was crazy. And this film, not only did they put it in the film JFK, I believe it had been seen once before on 60 Minutes or some American program. They aired it in on television in the US, but it was the first time I ever saw it, and they show it again and again and again in JFK. It was a big thing. There was websites released later on called JFK 100, in which they take 100 things said in the JFK film and they just try to debunk every single one of them. Personally think that JFK is a masterpiece of storytelling and editing. It sums up this thing that I think a lot of people, particularly nowadays, because we have such shitty conspiracy theories in the United States. But there is this conspiracy in the US is just, it's as American as apple pie. Truly, it is. Conspiracy is one of these things, and it seems like an aspect of folklore within the US just because
Mhm.
of the fact that, well, for one, they do happen. Like I have arguments with people when people say they don't believe in conspiracies. It's like, how can you not, how can you not, like it's just what occurs seemingly, and the US has perfected it, and it doesn't really matter if you don't believe in them or not, they're kind of happening.
Mhm.
And JFK is a great encapsulation of this idea of something that perhaps I'll touch on at some point in my podcast, although it gets people's tempers flaring quite a bit, in that the tradition of storytelling of the myth of conspiracy theories, because a lot of them are myths, but doesn't mean myths are not real. And so this falls into this category of a kind of folklore that exists, in which can be dangerous at times, but can also be beneficial, because we actually do find out that a lot of times, years later, these things that are considered conspiracy theories they're not theories that actually occurred. But yeah, this film JFK really kicked off the 90s in this idea of like the government is hiding so much shit from you actively all the time, and it can do things about it, i.e., can kill people. They can murder people, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the best encapsulation of this is through this film, JFK. Do I recommend it? 100%. I think that it should have won for 10 years. It should have won the Academy Award for Best Editing. It is the best edited movie I have ever seen. I think it is astounding in the way this film is edited. It's very persuasive. The facts in it put zero credibility in the things that are put forward in this movie. A lot of it is complete bullshit, but it is an encapsulation of the period of time after the assassination of Kennedy, that it just sums up the distrust and the whirlwind of playing with truth and what is true and what's going on in such a beautiful, wonderful way. If you want more truth, Oliver Stone released a documentary, I believe last year or 2 years ago, called JFK Destiny Betrayed. It's 4 hours, 4 episodes. Have a watch of that. And I defy anybody to say that there wasn't some kind of conspiracy to cover up some aspect of the JFK assassination. It's incredible. This is how it started. It was right here. But yeah, this huge distrust of the CIA and the NSA and all of these kind of things, which were under the radar for a bit, one of the people who was taken as inspiration for the film JFK, a gentleman by the name of Jim Mars, who I will have a link in the show notes. Go click on his website. It's like, if you want late 90s website design, this is a masterpiece of it. It's wonderful. Please, everybody, go to the website. Jim Mars was an author who wrote, I believe, Crossfire, The Plot to Kill Kennedy, which JFK was based on. But also this other gentleman, Brian, who is William Cooper.
He was kind of basically the forefront to what Alex Jones, became.
Yeah.
He had his own radio program, huge conspiracy theorist. I believe he was, also at the forefront of trying to connect the JFK assassination to the UFO agenda and alien agenda, and, believed that JFK was assassinated because he knew a little too much about aliens
Right.
and UFOs. And, and I had mentioned in your Google Doc how even that's something that comes up even now and the ufology field, and just if you even watching modern documentaries, I think a few years back I'd even seen one. I think it was by Stephen Greer, not somebody I entirely trust. I think he's kind of a wackadoo, but I think even he was perpetuating that same kind of myth that JFK knew a lot about aliens and he was going to tell the public about it, so he was assassinated for it. And then they talk about even how Marilyn Monroe was killed because of it, because he told her about it. And it's a bit much.
So he's one of these people that, as I was doing research for this episode, I kept coming back to Milton Bill Cooper, William Cooper, because I see his fingerprints almost in everything that we're going to talk about today. Like he was the one that came up. He wasn't the first, but he perfected the Uber conspiracy, the American Uber conspiracy, in which everything that you can consider, from UFOs to political assassination, is all connected in some way. He wrote a book called Behold a Pale Horse, which I have read, and it is crazy. It's so interesting, in that same thing that I was talking about, as reading into this kind of stuff as a kind of folklore and a kind of myth building, albeit one that a lot of people do take literally. It's really incredible. He started, I believed, talking about aliens to begin with, and then it just became one of those things where he had documents that he could prove involved assassination of JFK and things of that variety. And it's really out there. Eventually, he was involved in I believe, a domestic. It was a domestic argument, aggravated assault, and police officers came to where he was living in, I believe, 2001. And there was a shootout. He shot somebody in the head. I don't believe he killed the officer, but he shot somebody in the head, and then he was eventually killed himself. This, if people haven't heard of Milton Bill Cooper, I'll have an article. His influence is insane, and the stuff that he was promulgating is very influential. And you see its, as I said, you see its fingerprints through almost everything that we're going to be talking about today. And as I was doing the research for this, it's like, oh man, that points back to Bill Cooper. Like it's kind of crazy just how much.
Mm-hmm. He comes up a lot. This is kind of mostly how I'm familiar with him, is in Adam Gorightly's Saucers, Spooks and Kooks, which is a great book all about kind of the cow mutilation conspiracies and everything that happened to Paul Benowitz and Dulce Base in New Mexico. And Bill Cooper is brought up numerous times in that book as well.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating character. I don't know if I'd be able to do a whole episode about him, but his influence is vast as far as what is also occurring this decade. And you are right when you pointed out, when we were talking a bit earlier, that while his ideas are hard to swallow, the things that he was saying from an artistic point of view, X-Files probably doesn't exist without like the main myth arc of this TV show that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. I hope everybody knows about the X-Files, but that main arc, it probably doesn't exist without Bill Cooper. Like it's intrinsic to the development of that. He's so influential. Anyways, I don't want to stay on him for too long, but that whole idea of JFK being involved as part of a bigger conspiracy in some way, while it's not put in the film JFK, it's all part, but because of the interest of JFK became part of this conspiratorial thinking that would guide the rest of the decade itself. And yeah, it's crazy. And what occurs is that because of Bill Cooper and everything that he was promulgating, it ties into that distrust of government that I mentioned earlier, in which other situations, i.e., Ruby Ridge, which occurred, I believe, in 1991, and later on in 1993, it kind of gets peak militia and complete distrust in the government, and the fact that the American government is trying to actively forbid you from doing anything that it doesn't like with the Waco. I don't know what to call it. What would you call Waco? Would you consider it a massacre? What went on there, Brian?
I'm not. I know what happened at Waco. I'm not too familiar with names and those involved, and you know,
I'm going to call it a massacre. So what occurred was that the U.S. seized a compound of religious. They kind of consider them cultists. It was a complete debacle. It caused the deaths of quite a few people there. The Janet Reno, who was a politician in the U.S., she was kind of considered the scapegoat for this entire situation, which was handled really improperly by the ATF, who had arrest warrants for people inside. They locked themselves inside, and then the entire building burnt down. And so the fallout from things like Ruby Ridge, I'll have a link in the show notes. People can look up that, in which I believe a couple of people were killed there. I'm not overly familiar with it, but what you have is a cocktail for just distrusting the government, and that if you do anything that the government does not like in the 90s, particularly the first half of the 90s, that they can come out and get you. They'll get you. If you think something that they don't like, or you're promulgating something that they do not like, they can kill you, and they will. And they will have no bones about it. So this was hanging over this decade quite a bit. What do you remember about how enthralled people were? I'm going to switch gears here. How enthralled were people with Roswell? What do you remember?
mostly what I remember is, again, it's something we're going to talk about later. Is probably like Art Bell's involvement with it.
Right.
Him having a lot of the guests, having a lot of guests on his show that were those involved in the actual events. And it's yeah, I mean, I think I was a little unattached from that when I was like a kid, and as that was happening, kind of going back to my memory banks, I don't have a lot of, I knew of it, and I'd probably, I'm sure I'd heard some things. I don't think I can go back to a specific point that I remember actually hearing about Roswell for like the first time.
Right.
It's just at this point it's so ingrained and my subconscious that it happened at some point. I don't know when. I don't know if it was the early 90s. I don't know if it was, the 2000s or yeah, but I mean it's a phenomenon, and whether it happened or not, the city of Roswell now kind of depends on that kind of tourism that comes from that. So it's like, whether it happened or not, I think I tend to believe that maybe, there maybe was a crash or something. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think they definitely depend on that being the truth.
Yeah.
And whether now it has just kind of turned into like this, whether it's like an egregore at this point, or if it's something that actually happened, I don't know.
Right.
But
It is a huge phenomenon. I'm going to jump on that there. And I do remember hearing about it for the first time. It was from some shitty Entertainment Tonight something, or Inside Edition. Do you remember Inside Edition? These weird TV shows in which
yeah.
anything sensationalistic they would talk about.
Mhm.
It's kind of like National Enquirer, but on TV. And we didn't have too many television stations, but one of them that we did get was really, really grainy, and they had this Inside Edition thing on there. And I remember them talking about Roswell because somehow it had come up again. And then And then I started noticing when I would go to, I liked reading as a kid. And so I would go, when I'd go to the malls while my brother would try to go to like video game stores and stuff like that. And I'd join him, but I would like to go to the bookstores. There was in Canada, there was a Kohl's Books. And when you go up there, there's always like the new releases. And for like 2.5 years, I think from like 93 to 96, there was always a book on Roswell in like up at the front of the store because it's sold. And particularly one, there was a book that I had that I remember reading at least 2 or 3 times when I was a kid. It was called The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin D. Randall and Donald R. Schmidt. It's this bright green color. It's ingrained in my memory, but that was just the kind of thing that happened. It sold books. People were talking about this alien crash. It was such a big part of it. And that the government said it was a weather balloon. Again, they had to do another press conference in the 90s where they're like, yeah, it was weather balloon. And they just kept spitting things out. And that wasn't good enough for people. No, it couldn't be that. It can't be that because there's other stuff that's going to happen that we will talk about a little bit later on that was part of the whole phenomena. It was big. It was big. It was big. Um, just go back to 1993 and let's hang around there a little bit. 1993 was a big year for aliens. So one of the things that happened there was a film released called Fire in the Sky about an alien abduction case involving Travis Walton. Are you familiar with Travis Walton at all there? What can you tell the people?
Travis Walton was a logger, and he worked with some guys who were hired by the state to clear out forestry to help kind of prevent forest fires, things like that. And after a day of hard work, these guys were heading home. They'd seen a light kind of flash across the sky. He got out of the truck, he checked it out, and they kind of saw him more or less kind of get zapped. And they ran away thinking, oh shit, this dude is like dead. They came back and he was gone. They're the movie is very, very sensational compared to kind of the actual events.
Right.
But I mean, it's also kind of pretty close. It's just kind of a more dramatic telling of what happened. And they all had to take polygraph tests. They were all accused of kind of murdering and covering up this guy's body. He had issues with some of the guys that he worked with. Some of them didn't have very good reputations to begin with. And this is, I think that one of the crazy things about it is like the mathematical chances of these guys taking the lie detector tests and actually like passing them is like pretty insane. I don't know the numbers, but like I think that's one of the things that is definitely in their favor that this actually happened is like they kept passing them. And he showed up like a week or two later.
Yeah, yeah.
And was apparently abducted. And for a lot of people who talk about like communion was kind of their introduction to gray aliens and the fear that it instilled in their subconscious. For me, I somehow avoided communion, but Fire in the Sky was right there behind it to then instill that fear in me. Like I was absolutely terrified. I remember during the daytime watching, Saturday morning cartoons or something, or coming home from school one day and watching, Fox Kids in the afternoon, and there being a trailer for Fire in the Sky, and it shows the alien, and I remember being like, "Why the fuck did it do that?" Like I'm so scared.
The trailer was. I saw the movie years later, but the trailer scared the shit out of me.
Mm-hmm.
I had nightmares. I was terrified. My poor
Yeah.
parents. I was 10 years old and having nightmares because of a TV trailer. And you're right, they would show it in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah, one of the other things that kind of instilled one of my biggest fears as a kid was gray aliens. I was absolutely terrified of being
100%.
abducted. And part of that came from watching a lot of sightings, watching a lot of unsolved mysteries. Both of those showed those kind of things a lot. There was kind of, obviously with like the reenactments, when I was a kid, I didn't understand that that stuff was a reenactment. I thought it was real. Like I remember even watching Rescue 911 that William Shatner used to host, and thinking like, how are they always there when this stuff is happening? And it was the same with like sightings and unsolved mysteries, and being like, they have these aliens like on film. And I tried to convince myself that it was fake and it was reenactors and it was people in costumes, but I didn't get that. There was something, um, there's obviously something there that kind of had me believing that it probably wasn't real, that it was a reenactment. I just didn't understand that yet. But then seeing the Fire in the Sky trailer and seeing that like animatronic alien or puppet, whatever they were using, that there was no way at that time that I could convince myself that that like wasn't a real thing.
Right. 100%. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up unsolved mysteries, because while we don't have the time to talk about how it was an enormous influence on just this entire attitude of less so government conspiracy kind of thing, more of just paranormal, supernatural, as well as the idea that at any point either you might get swept into a satanic cult, or serial killers, they were everywhere, or just people going missing and all of that kind of thing. It's while that is a pretty good encapsulation of the attitude of the 90s, the weird 90s that we're talking about today, the absolute best encapsulation is that other thing that came out in 1993. While there was a lot of weird television programs, and for the most part, there was a TV show called Twin Peaks that kind of kicked off the 90s, done by David Lynch and Mark Frost. That if you haven't seen Twin Peaks, got to watch it. It's genius. And there was a couple of shows afterwards. I think the best example of it is like Northern Exposure, in which this kind of like weird America. That's kind of what's going on. There was another show that aired on Fox in 1993 that is truly the best encapsulation of what we are talking about today. And that is a television show that is called The X-Files. So, Brian, what is The X-Files?
It's like one of the best shows ever.
Yeah. So here's the thing, though. A lot of my listeners, they're quite young. They'll probably never, they've probably heard of the X-Files. I know for a fact they didn't watch it when they first aired or them whatnot. So let's, besides assuming that all of my listeners have heard of the X-Files, how would you describe X-Files to somebody who says like, look, I've got 1 minute. Tell me about the X-Files.
Okay. Yeah. So basically X-Files is kind of like a monster of the week kind of show. Whether the monster of the week is an alien or the government or a terrorist or, some weird natural phenomena that you can't explain, or a ghost, or, pick something and they can make it, terrifying, or the monster of the week. And, it involved Agent Mulder and Scully, and you had Mulder, who was kind of your weirdo who believed everything, and Scully was kind of your agnostic science type who questioned everything and would try to explain it with science. And Mulder wouldn't. Like anything and everything was like a possibility. And so you kind of had that contrast that worked so well, and you had the will they, won't they, aspect of it. And
what do you mean by will they, won't they? Because this is one of those things where in retrospect you're like, why were we so enthralled by this? But it's true. Like what was this thing that will they, won't they means what?
Are they going to are they going to kiss? Are they going to finally kiss? Are
are they going to hook up? Are they going to shack up?
Yeah.
I remember specifically, I forget which which magazine, but there was a magazine in which there were it was a top-down shot of David Duchovny, who plays Special Agent Mulder, Fox Mulder, and Gillian Anderson, who plays, what's her first name? Scully?
Dana
Scully. And they're in bed together. And it was a huge thing. That magazine flew off the shelves. Yeah. But the will they, won't they of the X-Files was, will they have a romantic relationship at some point in the show? But besides that, very well put. Yeah, it's a show that involves specifically the paranormal and the supernatural and all of the craziness there, government conspiracy. It is just a perfect distillation of the weird 90s. genius in a way. I'm going to give people a little bit of a backstory here. So the creator of this show, a gentleman by the name of Chris Carter, who was working for Disney. But even before this, he was writing for surfing magazines. He was big, he was big into surfing of all things, in California, and he worked for Disney writing comedies. And he was given kind of like the opportunity to write a pilot for Fox for some kind of an hour-long program. And he read an article about how about a survey called the Roper Survey, and was put out by Bud Hopkins, who is an interesting character that we don't have time to talk about right now. But also, he was big in the '90s, particularly involving aliens, in which Bud Hopkins extrapolated in the survey that nearly 4 million Americans specifically, had thought that they had been abducted by aliens. And Chris Carter thought that this was very cool information. He also was like, people believe in conspiracies. The world is very wrapped up. So this is kind of like this is running on the fumes of the JFK conspiracy stuff and all of the things that came from there. And he's just like, I'm going to write a pilot about this. And eventually it got picked up. And the rest is TV history. He says something very interesting though that I want to hang on to here. He said that he viewed that the alien abduction experience, Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, he said specifically, he viewed it as a bit of a religious experience.
Mm.
And I think that this is very fascinating because the 90s was probably by that point, was the most secular period in the United States. I mean, it's much more secular now, and religious people say that America is a profane country now. It's turned its back on this idea of religion and Christianity and God, but that something else was taking its place in the 80s and the 90s, and this was this religious experience, the mystical experience that comes from alien abduction. 4 million Americans, America is a big place, but that's a lot of Americans who believed or who were said to have believed that they were abducted by aliens. So do you buy into this idea of the religiosity of the abduction experience by people, that a lot of people have felt so lost by this point that this kind of idea becomes one which has pull on people's imaginations? And because I truly do think that a lot of people who have abduction experiences, a lot of people criticize these people, and a lot of people say that they have problems. Even David Duchovny himself, the person who plays Fox Mulder, said that a lot of the people who reached out to him who said that they had abduction experiences, he considered them sad people who probably needed to get a therapist. But a lot of times when you sit and actually talk with people who have had experiences, as I have, I truly believe that they think that something's happened to them. They don't understand.
Yeah.
They believe that something's happened to them, and it's profound to them. It's really one of those things where they think something big has happened in their life, and their life has changed because of it. Do you think that this has some kind of gravity? And do you think that Chris Carter was right to be like, there's something here. There's really something to go along here?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've had my own experiences too that I can't explain, things that I've seen and experienced. My earliest going back when I was 4 years old, and without going into too much, but literally waking up and seeing a goblin walk out of my closet and towards my bed, and it giving me the sense that like I didn't question it. Like this is literally my earliest memory.
Wow.
One of my earliest memories, and it walked out of my closet, and I recognized it for what it was, and it walked towards me, and it gave me the impression like, you're okay, go back to bed. And I lay back down and fell right back asleep.
Do you remember it?
And yeah, very vividly, and seeing the outline of it and the shadow of it, and and it's not the most extreme experience compared to what other people have experienced. I've had weird things happen since then without going into a lot of details. But reading a lot of these stories and reading abduction cases and reading the work of Bud Hopkins and other people, and John E. Mack especially,
John.
reading his book, Yeah, I do believe that these people experience something. They believe that it happened, and who am I to say that they're wrong or what they experienced didn't happen? Um, and I totally get the spiritual thing. I'm not like a huge fan of like Whitley Strieber now, but I think he definitely really leans into kind of like the spiritual aspect of things now. Um, and even looking at like the Betty Andreasson case from like the 70s. And that one, she was like someone who's very much like a Christian. And when she first interacted with the aliens, I think they asked her for like knowledge or something, and she handed them a Bible,
Right.
and they copied it. There were like four aliens there, and they put their hand on the Bible and made like four copies of it and like handed it out to their companions, and like read through it, like kind of like if you've ever watched Star Trek The Next Generation, you see Data consuming information and it like goes by real fast. It was kind of like that they flipped the pages and like consumed all the information at like once.
Right.
And and even something that happens later on in her experience where she's taken to either another planet or reality or realm or something, and she sees this like golden eagle figure that burns to ashes, and is kind of like a phoenix experience. And I think she kind of looked at it as like a Jesus Christ kind of resurrection kind of moment. So for her, it was kind of like, it was almost like for her, it was like a confirmation of like her Christian beliefs. And I think for some people, you know, it's either going to have them question their beliefs, but I think for a lot of people, it allows them to kind of maybe be a little bit more spiritual. Maybe there's a little bit more, um, you know, maybe God is real, or there is something, some other, or um, there's something out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the paranormal and the supernatural, whatever those are, not in a huge sense, but for a lot of people, kind of took over the idea of religiosity within their lives. The unknown of these things kind of took the place of a lot of the orthodox religions within the United States, and it's interesting that that was one of the things that was very attractive to Chris Carter, and he kind of saw that. And he put it into a TV show, which became a huge phenomenon. As Brian mentioned, the two characters, we got Mulder, Hoon, and Scully, two sides of his dualistic. This is Chris Carter's dualistic belief system and skepticism of paranormal phenomena. He always said, like, I want to believe it's real, but a lot of times I think it's just some of these things can be explained. Very early on, Entertainment Weekly predicted that the X-Files would be canceled. They were like, nah, it's not going to last. If you look at the numbers, though, it wasn't a smash hit right away. It kept gaining more and more viewers as it went on until it hit its peak in and around when they made the first movie. They did make an X-Files movie, and it was just the formula of the show was very simple. It was weird thing happens. Mulder and Scully are sent to investigate, and then things happen in and around them that leads them to believe that there's some kind of conspiracy and that there's an organization that just wants to keep these things hidden for the good of humanity, and it creates its own mythology. Truly, it does, in which characters like the cigarette smoking man. Who is just this shady background figure who's always smoking a cigarette, all of the elements are there. All of the things that we were thinking early in the early 90s and the late 80s get condensed within this thing called the X-Files. It was a phenomenon. It was enormous. And I remember in Canada specifically, uh, we were angry when David Duchovny, because the TV show was shot in Western Canada in Vancouver. David Duchovny had a new wife, Tia Leone, and he moved the production of the X-Files back to California, or to California from Vancouver, because he wanted to be close to his wife. Canadians were angry. Like we were like, because that was one of the things that Canadians felt was like part of our identity in the 90s was we got Jim Carrey and the X-Files are shot here and we see a lot of Canadian actors in the X-Files. But yeah, it was a huge thing. Brian, why was it so good? Let's talk about some of the episodes. Like, is there an episode of yours that you consider like your favorite, and why is it a good encapsulation of this television program.
One of my favorites, the name of it is escaping me, which is going to bug me, and somebody out there is probably going to know right away as I mention it. Um, One of the things that I was interested in as a kid, one of my favorite books that I had was a book called Born Different. And it was like a kid's kind of scholastic book, like a short kind of novel type book, but it was a, short biographies about um uh General Tom Thumb, kind of like your sideshow. um
Deformities.
yeah. And
I know what episode you're talking about. Sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, you already know what episode I'm
I know what
talking
episode you're
about.
talking about.
Yeah, I think it's in the 2nd season.
Called
This is
Home.
also
Called Home.
no, I know which episode Home is.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the episode where the guy has the, like, twin that was, like, on his
Oh,
stomach, kinda that little the little
right. Okay. I don't know the name of that one. Sorry, go
you
ahead.
know that they basically go to this community that has a lot of people who worked in sideshows, and they're all retired, and they're kind of being killed off like one by one, and they go to like investigate like what's happening. And I was drawn to that one because of the book that I read that was about people who worked in sideshows.
Not the one with
um
Jim Rose's circus in it?
I think so, yeah.
Ah, Jim
Yeah,
Rose's circus was in that one. Yeah, I forget the name of that one as well. Yeah, brilliant. Why is it so good to you? Why do you enjoy this one?
it's kind of weird. It's like a weird one, and it's shot kind of differently. It's kind of has that kind of surreal feeling that like the 90s had, where um where it didn't feel like it existed in an actual place. It was almost like it felt like it was in like an alternate dimension, almost the way that it was shot, but like you saw parts of things that you're familiar with.
Right.
um ephemera that you could kind of relate to from like the 90s, and things that you could see, but also it felt different enough that I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of like, this is incredibly off topic and something that's very different, but it's kind of like watching like the Adventures of Pete and Pete, which is like, that show was just very surreal, and the characters are very surreal, and the environment, is in a fake town, but there's enough that you can connect to like your own childhood and your own experiences, where it also feels kind of real. I don't know how to explain that feeling, or
Right.
or what to call that, but just this almost dream-like feeling of like reality. I don't know.
Yeah. I as I mentioned, there's this thing that a lot of people who are huge fans of the X Files will talk about. It's the main myth arc, and that's the one was the battle of the two characters, Mulder and Scully, against this organization, this syndicate of people who are trying to keep these things hidden, and it's the main antagonists of Mulder and Scully. And that's where the real meat and potatoes of this TV show comes from. I'll have a link in the show notes for people where they can get all of those. If you don't want to watch every episode of the X Files, because there's a lot of them, if you just go through the myth arc episodes, you will get a fantastic sampling. It's long. You're probably going to be taking at least 50 hours of your life to watch these things. But that's the main myth arc. It's glorious. It's wonderful. But it's not my favorite episode. My favorite episode is what is called the Monster of the Week. The writers were all just like, oh, we have to fill out, we have to pad this season. So it's us investigating some monster somewhere in America, and weird shit happens. It's an episode called Squeeze, I believe, in which they begin investigating a series of murders in which I believe people's livers are being taken.
Mhm.
And it eventually leads to some kind of a humanoid creature that is able to extend its body to be able to squeeze through ventilation shafts and things like that. And it allows it to take these livers. And then once it has consumed enough livers, it goes back into a cocoon, kind of like a its own little habitat where it hibernates. And Fox Mulder was noticing that this kind of thing happened in the past, and he was like, wow, this is interesting that these people's livers, and 6 or 7 people's livers were taken out in this one area, and it's happening again. That's just my favorite because it's paced really well. It's
Mhm.
creepy. It was one of the first times where I was like, there's something really special about this show. I really like these characters. And yeah, it scared the shit out of me. For a lot of people, the X Files could be downright disturbing. The episode I mentioned earlier called Home was so
Mm.
disturbing that they didn't rebroadcast when it was in syndication. The show X Files, a lot of stations wouldn't replay it because it was so disturbing for people. It deals with deformity and being inbred in families. There's an episode about a sewer monster called the Fluke Man. I forget the name of the X Files could be downright creepy, and that it was as
Mhm.
popular as
Mhm.
it was as scary as it was. And a lot of people really truly did believe the main myth arc that there is elements within the government that is just trying to hide things from you. And that is peak weird 90s. And yeah, looking back at it, a lot of the episodes not very good. A lot of the episodes are really just filler. But those main myth arc episodes, they're great. And if you've never watched the X Files and you're thinking of doing so, and you want to crank up the weirdness within your life by the content that you consume, highly recommend the X Files. Every once in a while, just watch one that has some kind of weird, silly monster, or somebody that can stop people's hearts just by looking at them and things of that variety.
Mhm.
They're good. But every once in a while, you come across an episode. Not every once in a while. Quite often, you come across an episode and it's like that is boring. Uh, First movie, well worth watching. I remember seeing it in theaters
Mhm.
twice.
Mhm.
Second movie I never watched. Came out in 2008.
It's
Just
not good. It's not
oh,
a good one. No.
but highly recommend the X Files for folks. It really did ramp up the discussion of conspiracy and aliens within the general population, and I kind of consider 1995 peak alien for the 90s, halfway through the 90s. And it's because of one thing. And it was a TV special that was aired in 1995 called Alien Autopsy. Brian, do you remember Alien Autopsy?
Mhm. Yes.
So there was this guy who was a part of the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation by the name of Jonathan Frakes. He also had another TV show called, I believe, Factor Fiction. That's the
Yep.
name of the TV show. Apparently, they got a hold of a film of in the 40s of an alien that was dead, and it's black and white, and it just shows a body of an alien. It's very short of an alien being dissected on a table, and they're cutting into it with their scalpels, and they're removing organs and putting them in certain places, and it's very convincing. The clock on the wall looks like it's from the 1940s. The things that they're wearing look like it's from the 1940s. Um, it was after it aired. I wasn't able to watch it because I just didn't air on the TV. I lived in rural Alberta in Canada. I did not have any of the channels that would have shown it, but I remember getting to school for the next day, and it's all every the kids just talked about it for the
Mm.
next 2 weeks. It's all that kids would talk about. It was a huge phenomenon, and in my mind, only the O.J. Simpson verdict was a bigger thing that year,
Mhm.
1995. Alien Autopsy, it was aired twice. The second broadcast, which came a few months later, it had even more viewers because of the notoriety of being shown the first time. But yeah, Factor Fiction, Alien, Alien Autopsy, Factor Fiction, huge thing. And if the Greys had already kind of been a thing because of X Files and Communion, now the Gray aliens were just everywhere, and this TV show was nuts. And eventually, it came out that the footage was obviously faked and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I will say, the special effects were really good. Like the scalpel cuts and things like that are the most convincing to me. It's like
Mhm.
that is tough to do. So they did a really good job on it. What are your thoughts of Alien Autopsy, Bry?
It's interesting. It's kind of one of those things where it's like I'm not sure entirely how to feel because watching it now, it's quite clear that it's fake,
Yeah.
and that it was, to me, it was quite obvious that it was even created in the 90s. I think it was. I don't
Really?
know if it was. I don't know if it was created. specifically for this special. I don't know when the original film of this autopsy was made,
Yeah. It's
but
made in London. It was done in London. I'll have a documentary in the show notes that I watched a bit of it. It's worth watching, just the
yeah,
how the stuff came about.
it felt. We actually watched it again last night.
Oh
We
yeah?
wanted, yeah, we wanted to watch it again last
Yeah.
night. So we watched it, and it's weird. Even the footage felt more modern, more
Yeah.
80s 90s modern than it felt like 40s or 50s.
Right.
Um, and the the thing that is strange about it is because they bring, actual witnesses and children of people who were actually part of this, um the Roswell crash, and people who actually handled materials. And I remember, I think one of the daughters of the general, or the rancher, or somebody, being a part of it, and was clearly kind of traumatized, and of things that they had experienced. And that was kind of the weird thing about this, and kind of felt exploitative, because you have them a part of it, and I feel like their testimonies come across very genuine.
Yeah.
And then and then you get to Jonathan Frakes in the video, and then it's like, oh, like, I wonder if they knew that, like, the interviews they were recording, if they knew it was going to be a part of this or not. Like, I'm curious how they felt about this video, if they knew that, it feels like some of them might have been exploited a
Yeah.
little bit. And even to find out now that, like, the claim in the video is that this video was filmed by, like, a military soldier, and they brought this guy on film. And even the military soldier they brought on film was, like, a homeless man that they found on the street, and, like, had him become a part of this thing. And it's not very tasteful
No.
now to look back and see that.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's really interesting to see, but then when you really dig deep into it, it's kind of like, oh, that's shitty.
Just more 90s exploitation. Just
Yeah.
general 90s shittiness. Yeah. I remember being able to see snippets of it. I forget how. I think they might have sold a VHS of it afterwards. And
Yeah, I think there is.
I think one of my friends had it, and I was able to watch it a couple of months after it aired the second time. It freaked me out. Like,
Mhm.
I'm squeamish by nature. Like, I find the idea of blood and stuff. It's rough for me, and it was particularly when I was younger. Um, as I spent a lot of time in hospital when I was young. I was very sick, and so
Mhm.
the kind of medicalization of medical horror to me was something that I just got my
Mhm.
hackles up. So it scared me.
Yeah.
It really bothered me. Alien Autopsy really bothered me, and I don't remember if I thought it was 100% real. I just remember that whatever was going on, I found deeply disturbing. And
Mhm.
for 12-year-old Douglas, it was one of those things that I found very persuasive in just how horrifying it was. But yeah, it's one of those things. If you watch it now, it's if while the X Files in a narrative way might be a really good way for people to see how weird the '90s was, go watch Alien Autopsy: Fact and Fiction. It's just like that's like it kind of makes you feel gross. It's just the exposition is really ham-fisted.
Yeah, it's got, like, it's got, the alien looks kind of like bloated a little bit. It's kind of got that, like, dead body bloat, and it's got, like, a huge chunk out of its thigh, and just has this dead, eyes are kind of glazed over.
Yeah.
It's very well done. It's very creepy. They've got, parts of it blurred the whole time, blurring, like, genitalia and stuff, which is kind of, weird all like,
That whole '90s blur that was everywhere. Yeah, it's certainly probably one of the best encapsulations of just how weird the
Mhm.
'90s were. Yeah. So while we have talked about some of the cultural touchstones as far as things being produced, artworks such as JFK and the strange exploitation hack job, but still convincing, creepy Alien Autopsy, and the brilliance of the Monster of the Week show that was the X Files, we haven't really spoken too much about individuals who really encapsulated this period of time, this decade. And there's only one person that we have to talk about as far as this is concerned, and I really enjoy this guy. Let's talk about the one and only Art Bell. So, before we get talking, and I'm going to do a bit of a biography of Art Bell. Brian, who was Art Bell?
Art Bell was a radio host. He hosted Coast to Coast AM, syndicated everywhere. Uh, Even listening now, it's like uh, over 100 radio stations and networks. I think it was on, and he'd have people call in, and he knew exactly where they were. They would just have to tell him the WKGA, and he would know exactly where that was. Um, and he started in politics, and then one day he just got weird with it and started talking about aliens, and the ratings went up, and there was nothing they could do about it. And from that point on, it was just everything weird: conspiracies, aliens, ghosts, demons. He had exorcists on, and witches, good witches, bad witches, and
Yeah, I get a little bit giddy when I talk about Art Bell. It's one of those things where, for a certain generation, he was such a big thing, and specifically across North America, because a lot of Canadians were able to listen to Art Bell as well. When I have to go out into the public and I have to meet people that don't know that I'm a podcaster, um, and particularly when I'm meeting people that are my age or a little bit older, or perhaps just a tad younger than myself, I introduce myself. I'm Doug, and then eventually some people will ask what I do. I'll say I'm a podcaster, and they go, "What do you podcast about?" And I say, "Oh, I." This is literally what I say. "Oh, I do a podcast about the history of." I start with esoteric philosophy, witchcraft, magic, and the occult. And usually, this is followed by the other person that I'm being introduced to or talking with. They'll say, "Oh, did you listen to Art Bell?" And I say, "I did." And they
yeah.
and they will talk. They'll ignore me, but they'll just start
Mhm.
talking about their favorite Art Bell episodes. They'll start talking, and it happened as recently as 2 months ago. I was in Calgary, Alberta, and somebody I mentioned I have a podcast, and they're like, "Oh man, I was a security guard. I used to just listen to Art Bell all like I just my entire shift. If I didn't have Art Bell, I don't know if I'd be able to do the stuff that I do." So Art Bell was a very special individual. I think he is he was the heartbeat of the weird 90s. He truly was, and I absolutely love him. So, within this episode of the weird 90s, we're going to do a little mini fools gallery for Art. I don't think he gets his full episode, maybe someday, but I absolutely love Art Bell. Brian, how important was he to you?
Am I kind of, I've talked about the environment I grew up in, and that kind of disconnected me from like a lot of things, from kind of exploring a lot of things that were outside my kind of like fundamental bubble. I think I was lucky that things trickled in, and my parents weren't so strict that I couldn't enjoy a lot of the things that I did, like comics and some of the movies and things I had access to. Like my cousins weren't even allowed to watch cartoons.
Wow.
Um, and, you know, art was another thing that kind of trickled through and into my little bubble. And I think probably because he was on AM radio,
Right.
and AM radio is so much attached to the right leaning media. And I remember my dad listening to guys like Rush Limbaugh and stuff, so like the car radio was always set to that station. And at night or in the evenings or afternoons, if an episode was being syndicated again, um you would more than likely catch art as well. And I I was talking to Virginia about it, and I was like, I have so many vivid memories of being in the car and hearing Art Bell. And I think about like when he aired and us living on the East Coast as well. Um, like at the time, like why was I in the car so late? Like, I don't know. I don't know if it was like, traveling to another state to visit a relative and kind of catching Art Bell along the late night travels. But like, he was always on. My parents would go to sleep with the radio on, and their room and my room just being right across the hall, I would hear it, and they would have on the AM radio station. So it's like I would sit up in the middle of the night on a school night and just be secretly listening to this Art Bell show and being absolutely, terrified of the things that he was talking about, whether it was aliens, or there's one specifically where I think he had an open caller show, and he had people talking about like mirrors, and a woman was talking about having a mirror in her closet, and then her and Art were started a conversation about, mirrors and closets are gateways for like the other side to come through. And it just, and thinking back to my own experience of seeing an entity come out of the closet,
Right?
I was just like, holy fuck, man.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a different experience with Art. He wasn't on any of the radio stations that I could get in Canada, unfortunately. I know he was on in Canada, but specifically where I lived in Canada, I couldn't get him on any of the radio stations in and around Calgary, Alberta. But what I did have is that my parents were one of the first people to get the internet. Right? I remember a neighbor being able to converse with a neighbor through a bulletin board system, which was very early in internet, early 90s, right? Because my dad did some work at home. We had to have a modem and all of that kind of stuff. Anyways, I'm getting far away from it here, but um, I found out about Art Bell somehow. I forget how. Might have been through another TV and somebody mentioning him on TV, but I was able to find a website that would put up his episodes
Mhm.
day or two. They would upload it, and my little 36 kilobytes a second modem that I had living in the middle of nowhere, Alberta, foothills of the Rocky Mountains, I could download. It would take like an hour to download, like an hour of art.
An hour? Dang, you had good internet
Right?
then.
I know, right? State of the art. But they would air the next day, and I'd be in my room. The computer was downstairs, and I would go downstairs and I would listen to Art Bell, just with our shitty speakers. And yeah, I could get him the day after. And this website was so rudimentary. It was either GeoCities or Angel Fire that they
Mhm.
put it up. And yeah, I could get his episodes the day after. And I just was enthralled by he, we'll talk about a bit later about what made Art Bell great. But I want to talk a little bit about Art himself. Yeah, he is the founder and original host of Coast to Coast AM, which is still on. It's being hosted by who's hosting it these days? Is it
It's still George Norrie, I think.
still George Norrie? Anyways,
Yeah.
yeah, he was syndicated across hundreds of radio stations at his peak. I think well over 150 radio stations had him. One of the highest rated hosts of radio. But yeah, he was born June 17th. So coming up to the birthday here, 1945. He was a military boy, born into a military family in North Carolina. Some people come to radio as a job. Art was born to do radio. He had
Mhm.
the radio voice. He loved radio. Even early on, he somehow was involved as a kid, as like a 12 or a 13-year-old. He was playing around with radio, just loved it. Yeah, it was his thing. He joined the Air Force, and he eventually went to Vietnam as a medic. And while he never saw combat, he saw lots of injured and dying people in the hospitals there. Eventually, he was positioned in the Amarillo Air Force Base. He got involved in a pirate radio station there. The signal, because it was close to a base, was so strong it could be heard outside of the base, and it was very popular. His show was quite good. He would play rock and roll. That was his thing. Eventually, he was stationed in 1966, I believe. Did he move there? I don't know if I have this information correct, but he was in Okinawa in
Mhm.
1966. I believe it was the only non-military English radio station in Okinawa. I
Mm.
forget if he was in the military still or if he had been discharged by this point. Very popular radio station because obviously the only non-military radio station in Japan. And eventually he came back to the United States. He worked in radio stations, mainly playing rock and roll all across America. At one point, he found himself in Anchorage, Alaska. And he heard about the children who were stranded in Saigon before the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, and he was able to get donations in Anchorage. Enough people were able to send in donations that Art Bell hired a Douglas DC-8 to fly to Vietnam and bring children back home to be orphaned children to be adopted. So this kind of shows that Art had a big heart. Like he was a good
Mhm.
guy. He seemed a good guy. And that kind of comes through in his voice if people really listen to him, I think, for the most part. He could be a bit of an asshole, but that's can't we all? Anyways,
Mhm.
he moved from rock music to talk radio, as Brian mentioned, and eventually he found himself in Nevada, where Brian is living now. Um, in 1988, he went to was it Pahrump? Is it
Yeah, it's Pahrump.
Pahrump?
It's about an hour from here from Vegas.
Nice.
Just kind of on the outskirts of Vegas.
And that was his base of operations for basically almost his entire career was
Mhm. Mhm.
this Pahrump little radio station. He changed the name of his radio show to Coast to Coast. Originally, they were talking about politics. His politics were popular. And then, yeah, he started to talk about conspiracies and gun control. That's the other thing. Don't forget this. He started talking about gun control and conspiracies. That's how he started. And then eventually, ratings started to go up. More people wanted to listen to him. And more syndication occurred as he started to talk to more and more people. He had guests on, he had people calling in. A lot of his call in shows were very, very popular. And by 1998, he was the highest rated radio show in America. 15 million listeners every time he would talk on the radio. At the time, that was half the population of the country that I live in. 15 million people. Like,
And even doing that at his time slot too,
yeah,
from like midnight to like 6 in the morning or something is like nuts that he had that many viewers at that time.
it's great. Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. um, so what did Art do that was so different? What made him special? A lot of times his guests, he would have great rapport with his guests. I remember he was just born to do radio. He could talk, and he was good at giving people their space to explain things. And he always have these really great questions on his call-in show. He would let anybody come in, and they could say the craziest shit. It was wonderful. Art was just really great in that regard. I really think that Art just did some really amazing stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, he at a period of time when talk radio was really just about yelling at each other, which it was. That was 90s radio, was people being loud and obnoxious. Howard Stern, like towards the end of the 20th century, Howard was really typified American radio, but Art had his own thing and he did it very, very well. And just his voice was so good. I think
Mhm.
that he
Mhm.
was a really special person. We'll talk about it a little bit later on down the line. He had some episodes that were pretty infamous. The one that is my absolute favorite, I don't know if you've listened to this one, was
Mhm.
I remember listening. It's so let me just take a second here to say, if people who were not born in the 90s go back and listen to this episode that I'm going to describe called Mel's Hole. If you go and listen to the full thing, I'll have a link in the show notes. You'll be like, what was everybody huffing back in the 90s? And why would this be Douglas's favorite show? But Mel's Hole was just the craziest, most awesome thing I remember listening to. So, what Mel's Hole was about was a dude by the name of Mel Waters comes on to Art Bell. I believe it was in February of 1997. And he starts talking about how he found this bottomless pit and that he would put fishing line, he put a weight on the bottom of some fishing line or attached to some fishing line and was spooling it down this hole, and it just never hit bottom. It just
Mhm.
kept going and going and going. And he would talk about all of this strange paranormal stuff that happened to this hole that was somewhere in Washington. He claimed it was outside Ellisburg, Washington State. He talked about how Mel talked about how somebody threw their dead dog into the bottomless pit.
Mm, mhm.
Later on, Mel saw this dog walking around completely alive. What other stuff happened there? Like, yeah, just the
He
weird
he he came back, I think,
he did. He had to
like two or three times. I think he came back. At one point, they like lost the property to the wife or something. I think he's going through a divorce, and then at another point, like the military basically came and seized the property, and
right. Yeah, he just his description and just the nonchalant way that he talks about this really weird stuff and how it kind of has parallels to the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Color from Outer Space. Like it made for very engaging radio. Just I think it's
Mhm.
most disarming thing is just how nonchalant he is about the absolute weirdness. And Mel is just, oh sorry, and Art is just loving it. He's eating it up and he's just feeding Mel, and Mel's
Mhm.
just like, oh yeah, yep, attached another 15, like 150 feet to the line. It just kept going down. It's just great radio. It's so engaging. So just a warning for people if they go out and click on the show note in this show and listen to the 3 hours, I think of all of them put together, you'll probably you'll wonder like, why is this good stuff? But it was just truly great radio. I love Art's enthusiasm. It's creepy. It's creepy to me that there's this giant hole that has
Mhm.
paranormal properties and that this guy is just like, I'm investigating it. It's not, there's no bottom to this hole. It defies everything. It defies physics. Geologists have tried, the people would try and find this hole. You'd hear about people going out and trying to search for it. Really weird. Did you get a chance to listen to Mel's Hole?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites too. Very interesting one. Um, yeah, I think that was so great about Art Bell is that whether the people he had on or not were telling the truth. Um, I think first and foremost, Art Bell was an entertainer, and I don't even think he believed the majority of these people half the time, but he knew how to engage them and give them the space to talk about these things and be weird and not be judged. And and that's what made so many of the, another thing that set him apart from so many other people is his open call system. Anybody could call, nobody was ever screened. He didn't have anybody answering the lines. He literally pressed the button and you were on the air.
Yeah.
And nobody did that. And he just let them talk about whatever they wanted,
Yeah.
whether they thought they were the Antichrist or whether they thought they were a time traveler. I recommend going back and listening to every Halloween. He would have
Right.
his ghost to ghost
Ghost to
series
Ghost. That's
where
right.
people could call in and talk about their own personal paranormal experiences, and those are always really creepy. Yeah, it's just great.
I think what I liked about Mel's Hole is that it was the creation of a new urban legend. Like this was
Mm,
a thing, and you can see. I don't know if it was a huge influence on the novel. I forget the name of the author, Mark Danielewski's. It's called House of Leaves, about a house that
mm,
kind of like defies. It's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, but these kind of this creation of this American paranormal
mhm.
folklore and urban myth is just it's so beautiful, and that's what the kind of what Mel's Hole encapsulates to me. And again,
Yeah.
yeah, he mentioned that he was on the show a couple of times, and he even mentions the location of it. I forget where, and people have gone there and they're like, "There's nothing there." And then some guy went there and he's like, "No, I found it. It's an old mine shaft. It's nothing like art or at like what Mel said it was going to be." Yeah, really bizarre. Great stuff. If you're going to listen to it now, just get rid of all expectations. Enjoy the ride. That's all.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
all I'm going to say. I think it was great radio back in the '90s. There's another one. The most notorious episode that Art Bell has ever done is known colloquially around the world as the frantic Area 51 caller. So on September 11th,
Yep.
1997, Art Bell doing an Area 51 show, open call, anybody can call in. Some guy goes on there and he's frantic. He sounds like he's having a meltdown. And he says that he worked at Area 51 and that there is collusion between the American military and these aliens that aren't aliens. They're interdimensional beings. And that this guy is on the run. They're trying to somebody's out to get him. He sounds very upset. Art's just kind of like, hold on, like, take a breath, my dude. Calm down. And the guy just gets more and more agitated. He's really not doing well. And everything that he's saying is just, it's wild. It's crazy.
Mhm.
And then snap, the line goes dead. And Art Bell is off the radio. There's dead air. The signal is completely, I'm not talking like this is an artistic choice. The signal actually went down. It not only took out Art's broadcasting, like the generators, backup generators, done. Right?
Mhm.
Art Bell is off air for 20 minutes. Eventually he comes back on. He's like, in all my years of doing radio, that has never happened. This guy sounded pretty frantic. Don't know what to do about it. That's very bizarre. Don't know what happening. Maybe what he was saying was in some way true. From my own thing, I remember, because it was the day after, I remember listening to it and they still had that 20-minute gap in there. It scared the shit out of me. I myself was having a meltdown. I was like, what is going on? I thought there was something wrong with the file that the person uploaded to the website.
Mhm.
So I would like click around. And then eventually when I was able to click to get Art's thing, and he was talking like, that's never happened before. I was losing my mind. I was losing my shit. Very, very odd thing happened. A few weeks later, or maybe a month later, somebody else called in to Art Bell's show and said that I made it all up. The guy was like,
Mhm.
I faked it. It
Mhm.
was a hoax. And Art Bell was like, are you sure? Can you like do it again? And the guy did it again. And it was pretty convincing that perhaps this was indeed the Area 51 caller. And it was just, he was trying to have some fun. There are people to this day that say, nope, that was a real thing. To be able to knock out a radio station is nearly impossible. Like there's no other explanation for it. But all I have to say about that initial caller,
Mhm.
great radio, great moment for the weird 90s and paranormal in general. It's one of those things that I will remember till the day I die. It was
Mhm.
yeah, scared the shit out of me. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what do you have to say about the Area 51 caller? What do you think, Brian?
Terrifying. Um, y the guy did sound, he's either a very good actor or he was, like, genuinely scared.
Right.
He sounded very terrified. And I don't know if I believe it. I'm still not sure. People do talk about how, I don't know if it's fact or not. Some people talk about how Art Bell had a lot of friends on the outside who would kind of call in and contribute
Oh,
to
right.
stories and play along with him. But then again, that's kind of like, I heard through the grapevine that this happened. And, you know, I don't know. Again, I've just kind of had my own experiences, nothing like, running from the government
Right.
and and trying to hide from, the FBI or CIA, or, being terrified that if I left my job at Area 51, they were going to hunt me and my family. Um, but yeah, I don't know. That's one of those ones where it's like I really don't know what to think. I don't know if the guy was being genuine or not, but I think enough weird shit happened that somebody could have been listening and been like, okay, this could be real, it could not be real, but there's enough here that we're not going to allow this. I don't know.
Yeah. I think what I found most disarming is just the way that Art is like so flummoxed afterwards. He's like, never had that. He kind of exhales a lot, I think, if memory serves. He's like, "Whew," like weird, never. Like, it
Mhm.
seemed like he was thrown. Like Art was
Yeah.
actually a guy who's heard everything in radio, and
Hmm.
he was just like, that's strange. That's a weird one. And which is why when the guy calls back in and says it's a hoax, he's kind of just, he sounds a little bit let down. Art sounds like a little bit like, all right, you do kind of sound like the guy, but I'm just gonna say that is in my memory, that's the first time where aliens are described as being interdimensional beings, where they actually like
Mm,
sat with
mm,
me. Like and I would later discover the work of like John Keel and Jacques Vallée, obviously.
mhm,
But that's the first
mhm,
time I was like, wait, these things aren't flesh and blood. They exist in dimensions beyond. Like that's the first time where I actually gave that some thought. And that to me was very scary as well. That like,
mm,
oh, they're not that thing that sits on a table that they can dissect. This is they can traverse this dimension and other
Mhm.
dimensions. They
Mhm.
exist there. That to me was very terrifying. And that somehow the United States military knows something about this, and they're trying to keep it secret, and
Yeah.
they'll kill you to get to it. Just very very 90s. Again, that's 97, so it's a bit late, but
Mhm.
still, it was definitely peak 90s weirdness. He had some guests. I'm just going to bring a couple up. Evelyn Paglini, who was
Mhm.
the witch, the one of the cool. She was Stringeria, Italian folk witch. Her and Art just had this wonderful camaraderie, like really cool
Mhm.
to see. Harlot, the unapologetic witch. Do you know what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, she's the one. I think she, like, sold her child's soul to, like, the devil or something, and, was very, very unapologetic about her, her kind of like, I'm an evil witch, and I work with Satan," and, yeah.
Just feeding those
And
fires of like the
and
satanic fire.
and that one's funny to go back and listen to, because clearly, the stations that Art Bell was on were usually right-leaning stations and networks, and he very much knew that that was his audience. So I think he probably got a lot of I think he got a kick out of having someone like this on the show, and even going back and listening to it and having people call in and try to, you know, refute her claims and tell her, to repent, and it's fun to listen to.
A lot of people say that that was, like, scary, and I remember listening to it at the time, and I just thought it was, like, another episode, but I think
Yeah.
I think those ideas, particularly for that period of time, again, I talked about just, it was a fairly secular place in America, but also, like, the fundamentalist Christianity was still a huge thing, and just the
Mhm.
fact that this person was talking about all the things they do in the name of Satan and stuff like that, nowadays doesn't play so well. We have so many people saying that they're Satanists and just, but but also the other thing is that what she's talking about is like so stupid. I hate to say, like it's just it's sensationalistic, right? Like it's
It's very, and it's even like when he has open callers and he has people call in who claim to be like the antichrists.
right.
It's very like edgelord. It's like people who call in and they're just like, oh, I'm like an evil person, and it's like, they're just
Yeah.
someone who trying to be tough, and they're just coming across more like a loser than they are. Like, nobody thinks you're cool.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, it made for some really great radio. Art, say Art Bell. Art kind of feeds into life in a way. He took a lot of retirements. He retired a few times and he came back quite a few times. A lot of times he said that he worried for his family's safety. Um, I don't know the validity of these claims very much. I haven't really looked into it. By the year 2002, I kind of wasn't listening to Art at all. I think he'd retired by that point, and he was coming back, and I was just like, I'm done. Like, I don't, they're
mhm.
not that interesting to me anymore. His wife passed away, and that was a big thing for him. I actually remember listening to that. He describes his wife's death, and I thought that was very sad. Like, he
Mhm.
truly did love his wife. Yeah, he became somewhat paranoid. Coast to Coast eventually switched hosts. He started two different new radio shows called one was called Dark Matter, and then he did Midnight in the Desert. He was a lifelong smoker, was he not?
I think so. He might have eventually quit, but I think for most of his life, yeah.
Yeah, he suffered from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And he died in the place where he loved doing his stuff in Pahrump on April 13th, 2018. He was only 72 years old. For a period of time, he lived in the Philippines. Did he not? Or
Yeah, it was after Ramona died. I think he moved to the Philippines, and I think there's kind of a lot of controversy around that, because I think it was only 6 months after she died, and I
right,
think he had already remarried, and
right.
he had a couple children with her, and eventually they moved back to Pahrump. But I think he was doing Midnight in the Desert out of the Philippines for a little while,
Okay.
and then they moved back to the States, and I think she now kind of manages his like estate and manages like his website, and he was buried next to Ramona. If you go to Pahrump now, they're buried together.
Hmm.
um but the way he talks about like Ramona, I'm not kind of big on the idea of like soulmates and stuff. But it kind of comes across like he was very much in love with her, and I think he was devastated when she died. I think she had like asthma or
Yeah.
something. I think it was like very
Severe,
like
severe
very very unexpected.
yeah.
And even Art Bell, he I think his was like an accidental overdose of like sleeping pills, sleeping medication, and he could probably still be around today if that didn't happen. That was very unexpected also.
Yeah, yeah. I'm shocked that it was only in 2018 when he passed away. I thought it was much longer.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems like, again, I through from about 2001 onwards, I just didn't listen to art. The magic had somehow been squeezed from the 90s. We'll get into a little bit
Yeah.
later as to why this occurred, but he it was also just the I think the paranoia for him started to become a bit tiresome. He just kept talking about how he worries for his family's safety and that there's people that are walking around his property and stuff like that. And while I'm sure sometimes that did happen, I don't think it was to the level, but of that he said. But yeah, it just. I'm not saying he became a sad character. It became his story became tiresome in a way, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
interest kind of moved on and things of that variety. But I have to ask you, do you think he was a genius in some way, a genius level entertainer, or do you think it was just right time, right circumstance for art?
I think it was all of it.
Yeah, all of it.
Yeah, I honestly think it was all of it. I think it was just the right time. I don't, I lost interest around the same time too. Once I was kind of in high school, the late '90s, early 2000s, I kind of stopped listening. I'd catch him from time to time late at night if I was up, or one time I had an overnight job at the time. I think in the around like 2005, 2006, and I remember catching him a few times where he'd come in as a guest host on Coast to Coast. um and obviously being very interested, but like it didn't have that same kind of awe and wonder that I had when I was younger,
Yeah,
and when he was like first on. And even going back and revisiting a lot of his stuff and listening to a lot of the later things that he did with Dark Matter. I think Dark Matter was only on for like a year or so, and
yeah, it
then
was short.
Midnight in the Desert he did up until he died. And even listening to a lot of that stuff, it's fun and it's great and I love listening to it, but it still doesn't kind of have that same feeling of a lot of the older shows. And um it's definitely a different vibe.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just the time that it takes place. It's not the '90s anymore.
No.
'90s had that, like I mentioned before, kind of that weird surrealness to it, that I think is not so present in this day and age.
Yeah, well, we'll get into a little bit of the whys there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think he really was a truly gifted entertainer. He's a radio man through and through. He had his own call sign, I forget not call sign, but he loved radio. I think he understood radio, and I think he understood what makes people interested in listening to radio. I think more than people would like to think. Like, a lot of people get famous for their understandings. Sorry, a lot of people get famous for the things that they say and how they say it. Again, you brought up the character Rush Limbaugh and stuff. It's just he's controversial, and that's what makes him popular. He was on radio for a long period of time. Art, I think, understood what made radio engaging, and
Mhm.
he knew when he had somebody on the line what questions to ask them. His guests, when he had on, he knew the angles from which to ask them questions. I truly think he was just a wonderful radio personality who asked the right things and
Mhm.
knew which questions to ask to keep people listening.
Mhm.
And when he needed to shift gears to go in a different direction, he always was able to get there. And it's tough to say this for people that don't understand because people don't have podcasts. And I'm not saying this like I Doug's like Art Bell. Please, nobody take that extrapolation from what I'm going to say. But he was so good at being able to direct episodes that he always seemed to be one step ahead of his guests and be able to
Mhm.
guide what goes and in a way where until you start doing podcasts and talking to guests, you don't understand how crucial it is to be able to keep feeding that, to be able to make an engaging episode. Like, I'm nowhere near as good as doing what Art does. He was he was, I truly think, a genius level entertainer.
Yeah.
It was right period, right time. But I think he was a craftsman, a radio craftsman. And, and while I know he kind of like ran out of gas, and just his stuff wasn't as interesting, I still do think that his stuff is just wonderful. I really enjoyed what he did, and I wouldn't say I miss Art Bell in that kind of way because I just kind of things had moved on,
Mhm.
but he was an important figure. Uh, and yeah, he's just responsible for a lot of the best moments and the weirdest moments and some of the best interests in my life. Truly, like
Yeah.
that's why we're doing this episode. Is just the things that he was promulgating, and the things that his show stood for are just things that to this day I carry with myself to this day. So let's say peak Art Bell was 96, 97, 98. X-Files, we got a movie. X-Files is still on the air. It's kind of running out of steam. And the latter
Mhm.
half of the 90s, I just remember being too much. It was just too much. There were so many specials about aliens. The Roswell thing was just getting stupid. Everything was getting stupid, and they were going far too big. And then we had new things to worry about, like the internet. And while I will mention that the internet towards the latter half of the 90s was beautiful and optimistic and things like that, there
Mhm.
were these dark corners and dark pockets wherein conspiracy thought was taken to like strange apocalyptic levels. And while 1998, 99, the internet seemed to take on a kind of cynicism, and the kind of brightness of information that was all there in alt groups and message boards and things of that variety started to get really dark. And the digitization of our lives was exemplified in this thing called Y2K, which is weird to explain to people because a lot of people who are listening to my show probably don't know what Brian. What was Y2K? Tell the folks.
So Y2K, they were kind of the way, everything had been coded. I think the gist of it was like they were worried that when the year turned over and the way that all this computer language and everything was coded, that it wasn't coded to account for like the millennium or something, or so they thought that as the second it was like 2000, everything was just going to like come to a halt, power would shut off everywhere, everything would shut down,
Nuclear
like
missiles.
planes, yeah, nuclear
Falling.
missiles would go off and planes would fall from the sky. And yeah, it was everywhere. And you'd go to Best Buy and they would have, things advertising. A lot of people took advantage of it. Buy this software and make sure your computer is up to date and safe from Y2K. And um it was huge. And I remember that New Year specifically. I've never been much of like a New Year person. I
Me
usually don't
neither.
care about the New Year. I don't,
Yeah.
it's not that big of a deal.
Time is
Christmas
an
is,
illusion.
yeah, Christmas is over. That's like the big last holiday I love to
Yeah.
celebrate. And like you're kind of coming down from that high of like, having Christmas and being on a long school break, at least at the time I'm in high school. And I remember that New Year specifically. One, because of Y2K,
Yeah.
two, because of The Matrix, and being absolutely obsessed with that movie. And that was actually the first time I saw it was on New Year of 1999 going into
Oh,
2000.
cool.
Um, I had a pretty cool youth pastor at the time that brought us all together and showed us The Matrix.
What? You guys go to the theater or was it on video?
It was on video at the time.
Oh,
We
was
all
it?
we all we all went to this guy Chris's house. He was like an older guy in the church, and he had like his own home studio set up, and like he had all the kids came over and stayed in his basement, and they put The Matrix on, and we watched it, and then we all stayed up till after midnight waiting for Y2K to happen, and yeah, nothing happened.
Nothing
Absolutely
fucking
nothing
happened.
happened.
Zero. Like I don't think people realize is like nothing occurred. It was no hiccups, no power outages, nothing. It was nothing. And yeah, it was the great disappointment that everybody, and there was very few people that were like being like, no, no, nothing's going to happen. Everybody seemed to be very cautious about it, and nothing happened.
Mhm.
Wah, wah. But yes, as Brian mentioned, there was a really bright patch when these ideas. I was talking about this cynicism. But there was this other thing that was happening in which the ideas of technology and our are computers helping us or are they not, and where's the does the human being situate themselves in these ideas of some kind of a near gnostic nature and investigating and injecting some kind of a mythology and a mysticism within this kind of weird cyberpunk world in which ideas, even from my last guest, Ramsey Dukes, wrote about how reality could be in some way a simulation, some kind of a virtual reality. All of these ideas are being fueled into comic books like The Invisibles by Grant Morrison, who was a huge influence on the makers of the Wachowskis of the Matrix film itself. Uh,
Mhm.
that's the Matrix was a really bright spot. I saw it in theaters and it changed my life. It was just
Mhm. Mhm.
it was so cool. And the DVD when you finally got it in 2000, like just the coolest
Yeah.
DVD of all time. New technology was something, but I just remember the idea of the Matrix itself was just so fascinating to me. So there were these bright spots, and we roll into the new year. Y2K, nothing happens, and it's at the tail end of the last 4 months of the year 2001 where everything changes. And I suspect that energy, that weird energy of the 90s comes to a complete end for me on September 11th.
Mhm.
Uh, we just got a huge dose of reality, I think. And
Yeah. Yeah.
while people can say like there was conspiracy theories from the very beginning and there was just a continuation of that kind of stuff, I remember for the first 6 months of 9/11, things were it was about materialistic reality and how hatred and being angry at the different in others.
Mhm.
There was no room for the paranormal or aliens there. Like it was everything was very terrestrial once again. And I hope this doesn't, sound sensationalistic, but when those two towers hit the earth again, I think they took Western culture with it. I think we were pushed to looking down at what was happening on this earth more than we had in quite some time. And yeah, if that was basically what was overshadowing the next little while. And so that I do consider 9/11 to be, uncontroversially the end of the weird 90s and that kind of strange paranormal optimism in which ideas of aliens and the supernatural and ghosts and everything that we've been talking about over the last 2 hours uh, was no longer important. It wasn't mainstream and it
Mhm.
wasn't what people wanted to talk about. It wasn't in any way, it was seen as being not important
Yeah.
or unpertinent. What for you is the kind of the end of the 90s? Would you agree that was 2001?
Yeah. 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 Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was something to experience and see live, especially at our age. And like I remember just being in my morning art class and a girl ran into the room from another room and told everybody to turn on the radio, and it was just
Yeah,
for days that's all you did at school is you watched that, and it just like, yeah, everything changed. So the atmosphere in the school, um the atmosphere at home, everywhere.
everywhere.
It was like being in America and that happening and seeing everybody like unite. And then is that was interesting, but then also just to see everybody unite towards their hatred of anybody who was
Different.
Islamic or brown or is just like disappointing.
Yeah,
And yeah, nobody gave a shit about these other things anymore because now they were all united in their hatred of other cultures and other religions who were the cause of, apparently were the cause of this. And we immediately went to war and were in that war for what, like 18-20 years, and just like,
a war on an idea, right? Like a war
yeah.
kind of idea, a war on terrorism. Mhm.
Yeah. And
No room for the paranormal or the weird, right? Yeah.
yeah, and it's weird too because even thinking back, that's kind of even my own interest in that stuff is when I kind of stopped.
Right?
I feel like so many of my interests changed after that. So many of them were just grounded into there's definitely a lot less, even a lot less like escapism. Like I'm trying to think back and just like, I wasn't escaping into these other realities or interests as much anymore. It was just like it just became about going
Politics.
to
I
like,
remember
yeah,
being
yeah,
obsessed with politics.
politics, huge,
Politics was like
huge. That's like it. And
I
I
stopped caring about like the other stuff, like the fantasy, and like I became interested in politics. Like
yeah,
that was
yeah, yeah. I at the time too became super interested into it. And that's kind of at the tail end of when I, you know, was still like a Christian conservative. I hate to admit that like I voted for George Bush at the time because I thought I was doing the right thing.
right.
and like it was around like the whole Tea Party movement where I was like, what the fuck is happening? And after I graduated in 2003, I went to college and I was going to art college and I was starting to kind of question a lot of my beliefs growing up and kind of escaping that Christian fundamentalist bubble and examining things. And that's something that I have been doing and deconstructing for a very long time. And it's within the past, I'd say 5 years, and doing a lot of therapy and stuff, and that's where I've kind of have found interest in a lot of those things again.
Right.
It took a long time, but here I am, and
There
it,
you
it
go.
is worth it, worth the wait and worth all the work to get here.
I'm going to also say some other aspect of 9/11 that was big was it was the return of the recorded image again, right? The images of the planes hitting was
Mm,
just like
mhm.
to something that maybe people might find kind of shocking now. Just we kept seeing those towers fall and the people jumping and
Yeah.
like the atrocity exhibition was just it was the return of that videos and how the image can sway emotion as well. And what began in the 90s is like the emotion of using superior military technology to blow people out of out of their homes with missiles fired hundreds of miles away to people stuck in a tower jumping. Like the return of the video image for truth and guiding emotions. 9/11 really was the return of that again, and it's fun to think about. Not fun. It's interesting to think about in retrospect. I hope we're not saying things that are too obvious for people, but it's hard to encapsulate again just how emotional the images of 9/11 were,
Mhm.
and specifically of that day, the dust clouds and the surrealness of everything that had culminated through the 90s to the hardcore reality of hurt and pain that was felt on that day was a real shift for everybody, I think, and it affected absolutely everybody. Yeah, end of the weird 90s. Full stop is what I wrote on my document, and it's really did come to a screeching halt. So,
Mhm.
why the hell are we talking about the 90s on a magic occult podcast? Well, I still feel like the 90s set the tone for much of the next quarter century of what happened now. Now, hear me out. There's a lot of distrust with the government, not just in America, but pretty much all over the world. Again, the conspiracies did not go away because of 9/11 in some way. 9/11 accelerated a lot of conspiracy and conspiracy thinking. Like the return of the recorded image and the images that are being used from things like the Abu Ghraib to soldiers during the second Gulf War who are just chatting with each other while they are using technology to blow people up on ground and all of these kinds of things. Yeah. As well as things like the nascent forms of technological communication from ICQ in the 90s through to MSN Messenger, through to, man, Friendster, MySpace, Facebook, and everything that we have now. That saw its germination through a lot of people who in living in California specifically, who were involved in the weirdness of in Silicon Valley. That's part of their gift, and a lot of them were full on to how weird the '90s were, and that's kind of where we get a lot of our stuff. The early internet, as I mentioned earlier, was a breeding ground for strange ideas regarding magic and the occult. The If the X Files doesn't exist, you don't have the Invisibles. Truly, you don't. And you don't have these kind of things given space within
Mhm.
mainstream culture. That is where it all comes from. And that strangeness was then filtered through things like chaos magic and the ideas of Ramsey Dukes and simulation. Uh, s- uh, s- uh, the idea that this is a virtual reality, those kind of sub Gnostic ideas were given sway in some way, and it was put up on the internet, and you could engage with it, and people were talking about it, and yeah, it fueled chaos magic, which had found, it was a big thing in the '80s, but it was given new life truly in the mid '90s because of the fact that all of these ideas were so strange, and people were seeking these things, and they were finally able to go to a place, not a library, to be able to get these materials. That's a huge thing. I remember, yeah, it might have been in the 21st century, but the fact that I could go to, what was it, Chaos Matrix, or online, like, to just find these ideas, and that they were there, and it was wonderful that we could do that. So while the '70s and the '80s had periods where these sorts of interests in the paranormal and supernatural were popular, things like In Search Of, which I believe was Leonard Nimoy,
Mhm.
and Arthur C. Clarke's Forbidden Worlds. I forget the name of these things. These things, while they were popular, the '90s was when they all went totally mainstream. When you could make more than one series of, or one season, or 15 episodes involving these kinds of things, and they were the other thing. And while we might be able to argue back and forth as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, they were commercially viable. People could make money writing about these kind of strange things, and Bill Cooper could indeed get himself a radio show. Did you know Bill Cooper hated Art Bell?
I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he just hated him. He called him the art of bullshit or something like that. And
Mm.
yeah,
Mhm.
but there was an audience for this kind of stuff. People were buying these books, and I still have books that I bought in the mid '90s of all of the craziness. Do you think that, Brian, speaking from, because you engage also with the commercial element of the '90s as well. You had a website called Deep Space '90s, which I just love the name. And while
Yeah, that
it went deep into it's one of those things where you also have a lot of the DVDs and video cassettes. I've seen your collection
Mhm.
of Sega games and things of that
Mhm.
variety.
Mhm.
But do you think that the commercialness of the '90s, the fact that this kind of weird stuff helped or hindered? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helped it.
Yeah,
It's certainly helped me. It's helped me kind of cope with a lot of things, and in a positive way. Um, yeah, it just Virginia and I were talking about this last night too. We were kind of talking about like technology in the '90s and everything, and kind of like how fast things moved in
yeah,
the '90s and progressed. Um, like at literally the beginning of the '90s, we were playing with our Atari and our Nintendo Entertainment System, and then it was a Genesis. And by the end of the '90s, on the same CRTV, we had those three consoles, and then like a PlayStation hooked up to it. You're playing these really shitty 8-bit cartridges, and suddenly things were on a CD that at the time it was just like the graphics were absolutely mind blowing. And we saw technology expand so fast, and at the time for us it didn't feel like we didn't see, I think, the dangerous side of it.
right.
um and now we're watching technology progress even further, and now we have artificial intelligence that's trying to create artwork and that has absolutely no soul whatsoever. And again, going back to like the Matrix, and kind of the warning against artificial intelligence. And the Matrix borrowed a lot, I would say, not even borrowed, but stole a lot from one of my favorite authors, William Gibson, in his book Neuromancer.
Yeah.
Um, And again, just another kind of warning of like artificial intelligence and how dangerous it can be. And now here we are, where things, I think technology is progressing to a pretty dangerous point. Um, and it's and speaking of that, it's no wonder that people like myself are starting to revisit the 90s. And even Gen Z, I'm seeing a lot of Gen Z kind of revisit the 90s and take, my nostalgia as their own nostalgia, and like, I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah.
Because you live in this world now where like shit fucking sucks. A lot of people are really shitty, and we saw that with the pandemic and with Trump supporters, and just like things have become so divisive. And whatever you need to do to find your joy in life, if you've got to reach back into someone else's nostalgia or go back to the 90s and find the stuff that you loved, or 80s or 70s, 60s, whenever you're from, whatever you need to do, go find that joy and find the things that you love and cherish those things, and you know bring that out into the world and share that with the world so that we can all feel that joy too.
I like the weird last 5 years from 95 to 2000 was a very interesting time because everything just kind of got everything was really tired, everything was kind of really strung out, and this kind of weird overlying apocalyptic cynicism really took hold. And the best encapsulation of that, particularly as the internet started to take more and more of a grip on how we got information, was, and I just love the name. There was a website called Disinformation, and it was set up by about 4 people. The Disinformation Company, and you could go to this website and you just see the craziest, wackiest stories. And even if this was like the fumes of the 90s weirdness and where it got really serious, they would talk about like viruses ending the world and the art of just really weird stuff. I forget the name of Paul Lafley and things of that variety. Just Joe Coleman, and the best encapsulation of yeah, that strung out, tired 90s after the optimism has just kind of waned away, was the Disinformation Company. And if you don't have that, and the fact that they're looking at things like chaos magic and the work of William Burroughs and all these interesting ideas being promulgated again, then you don't have me. You don't have this podcast. That's where that comes from. It's the Disinformation Company that was a huge influence on me, even if it was in the 21st century when I mainly engaged with the website disinfo.com. Uh, I was going to it for the ideas from the 90s as filtered through the website Disinformation was glorious. It kept people curious. It kind of shifted from Art Bell and his openness to a kind of pointed urgency that was very instrumental in how I am. Yeah, the 90s was fun with alien abductions and all of that kind of stuff and the X-Files. But when things started to get serious and when magic started to get sprinkled on top of that, that's truly where I get who I am. that's and that's something that I find very beautiful. Uh, but I will also say that the 90s, I keep seeing the usual suspects come up over and over again. George Knapp, he's still around. You know,
Hmm.
this these figures, Bob Lazar, still around, still
Hmm.
talking, and as relevant as he's ever been. Again, um, and it's been over the last 5 years again. The last 5 years seems to be more 90s ish than at any other point in the early aughts or in the 2010s. It's odd to see the circuitous nature of interests in these kind of fringe topics. And so a reinvestigation of the 90s is something that I've been doing a little bit more since you kind of came into my life, Brian, and just an idea of like, why was this the last time to me that it seemed like everybody seemed to be on the same page with the paranormal stuff and the interest in it seemed to be the same. And why is it again since I started my podcast? Because this podcast, this episode specifically, is the podcast that is my 5th year anniversary of doing my show.
Wow.
Well, yeah. Why does it seem like this last 5 years has seemed more 90s than at any other point since the 90s? And so, uh, it's very odd to me, and it's something that I've been trying to work through, and while I will have no answers for anybody who listens to this episode, um, that axiom that I'm gonna borrow 2 axioms. That axiom that the truth is out there is one of those things that keeps me seeking to this day. And the fact that, I think that nowadays, more than ever, as we see the world around us, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, or all the strife that you see and the idea of disaster, or the idea of that we're coming together in some ways, in very interesting ways, in how we want to express ourselves. And I see that more than I see the bad things, particularly with my podcast. Um, we all really wanted to believe in the 90s, and I see that want to believe has happened once again over the
Yeah.
last 5 years, and I'm very optimistic, uh, and that kind of optimism that I saw in the 90s returning now, I find a very beautiful thing.
Mhm.
So, that's all we have for the weird 90s. Did we miss anything? I know we just briefly talked about unsolved mysteries. Brian gave me this great bumper sticker that says, "Honk if you are working through your childhood 90s or childhood trauma from watching unsolved mysteries in the 90s." I butchered it. What did this bumper sticker say, Brian?
Oh my goodness, now I can't think of it.
Oh, it's like, "Honk if your childhood was traumatized by unsolved mysteries," and put it on the bumper
Let
sticker of a car.
let me look at my website.
I don't have it on my car yet, but, I'm thinking of putting it on there. It's been a wild ride, recently, and I think a lot of people are feeling. And what's interesting about the 90s is that a lot of the TV shows I see, they're trying to reboot them, which is this weird thing, like, why reboot fact or fiction? Like, why reboot
Oh, yeah, yeah, they're talking about that. I think they're talking about doing X-Files again.
redo
Um,
X-Files? It's just like, leave it alone. Everybody, these things have a time. These things have a time. Try to
yeah.
come up with something new. Please. Please, please, please.
Okay, the sticker says, and then I can't believe I forgot this because I'm the one who freaking designed it. Honk if unsolved mysteries contributed to your childhood trauma.
Beautiful. I wish we could have spent more time talking about, unsolved mysteries and what was this? Robert Stack was
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
genius.
Yeah, so many things about that were traumatic. It always started, with the reenactments and the stories kind of giving the city and location where it took place. And as a kid, that is all that I cared about seeing, because once I saw, that I was in San Francisco, California at the time, and this was happening in Phoenix, Arizona, or somewhere in upstate New York, I was like, oh, thank God that's nowhere near me. I don't have to worry about it.
So good. Yeah, I wish we could have spent a bit more time with unsolved mysteries, but, I hope people don't think that we're just doing this because we're looking back at a better time. The 90s were rough. Like,
Yeah.
there were aspects of the 90s that I'm just like, the exploitation and the racism, the homophobe, like,
Oh yeah, yeah.
it was a it was not a good period, and particularly for people listening who didn't live through the 90s, if you go back and engage in, like, a lot of this, the content that we're talking about, some of you are gonna be very shocked by just how dismissive and how upfront a lot of really shitty attitudes were.
Mhm.
Like, we have moved
Yeah.
on quite a bit, and it's even in the X-Files. The sexism in the X-Files is, like, it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, Scully was thrown in the back of a truck every other episode. It was always like using, like, the woman was always used as like a vehicle for the man to become triumphant.
Right. Yeah.
And even revisiting Art Bell, he knew his audience, and his audience was right-leaning people, and there are very times going back and listening where it was very distasteful, very homophobic, transphobic. So warning against that too.
Yeah.
Art, I think towards later on in life definitely was a little bit more left leaning. Hated Trump, despised Trump. But uh, yeah.
My goodness, the 90s, I will say that it's good that it's there. Let's leave it there. I liked the energy in some regards, particularly towards, the paranormal and the supernatural. I see it. I see things happening again, and there's that whole expression, it's overused, that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I'm seeing some rhyming done, and I have over the last 5 years, and it's kind of cool to be a part of it. I'm not saying this because my listenership is anywhere close to Art Bell, but I am consistently shocked with who finds my show and that they like it, and it's very cool. And I'm glad that I have the listeners I do, and I'm glad that that you yourself are on board as well, Brian. And thank you so much for being a friend and for all the good things. And it's wonderful to connect with people that really share just that past, that interesting past, although different.
Hmm.
We both had to get through it, and let's try and concentrate on the good, and while also recognizing what was bad. Truly. Brian, your magazine, tell us
Hmm.
about UFO Joy. I loved it. Give the people the steez. Let's get this magazine into some people's hands. Tell us, give us the 411 on this.
So Eufaula Joy is, you know, to keep it short, it's kind of a joyful look at like ufology, paranormal, supernatural, witchcraft, all of that stuff. I think it all I'm of the mind that it kind of I'm not, I'm not a nuts and bolts person. I'm a magical person, and I think it all kind of blends in. And
Right.
ufology is kind of exploring those things, and it's like I said, a joyful exploration of those things. And it's, Virginia and I kind of taking a lot of things from the 90s that we loved and using that to incorporate it into kind of the look and the feel. And and I mean even ephemera from like the 40s, 50s, 60s as well. um it kind of came about, me just getting into these things again and examining, uh you know kind of doing my own research and reading books about aliens and folklore and a lot of other things, and kind of being disappointed with like the current state of ufology. And you try to have any discourse on whether it's Reddit or Twitter, especially, I kind of avoid Twitter. People there are not very nice. And and I wanted to try to sorry if you're hearing things, my cat's walking through the blinds.
Oh, you're good.
Okay.
We're a cat-friendly podcast. One of my favorite parts of UFO Joy is a cartoon that or a comic you do involving one of my heroes, Charles Fort, and it's done in the style of Tintin.
Hmm.
And it's just I don't want to give away too much because I do want people to read this and because it's wonderful. It's a fun again, it's that nostalgia of getting those really visual little books. Like it had
Hmm.
like a book fair, which is like for me in the 90s, the book fair was like the peak. Besides like the days when I'd get out to go snowboarding and stuff like that, book fairs were like peak 90s
Hmm.
joy. I have been trying to chase the joy of a book fair my entire life. And there were these little like scholastic books that they'd give out for
Yeah.
free that would have these, and that's what UFO Joy is. It's really
Hmm.
wonderful. And I absolutely love it. I think it's brilliant. And
Yeah, thank you, thank you. That's one of the things that we definitely lean very much into was that scholastic book fair feel,
yeah,
and like eyewitness books.
right.
Um, Virginia spent a lot of time researching and writing an article in there about an Orkney witch charm from Scotland, and that's probably my favorite piece. And the first issue is her work with the Orkney witch charm. And she very much leaned into like the eyewitness books,
Okay.
which we both loved as kids. And me with the Charles Fort comic, I was telling you earlier before we started recording, you know the learning disabilities I had and not being able to read when I was a kid. And then when I first started actually be able to read, one of the first things I was reading, was the Tintin comics. And, I just loved them. It got me into comics. It got me into reading. And, so it kind of felt natural uh, to explore the life of Charles Fort through like the lens of Tintin and kind of how it looks, how it feels. Um,
I don't want to give away too many of the content. It's a small book. But it's well worth every page is so delicious and wonderful. And I say delicious in a kind of a punny way because you also have a recipe from Charles Ford in there, which is hilarious and it's done so well. And Yeah, it's a wonderful document. So, where can people find Ufology?
Twitter, ufolojoy, at ufolojoy, ufolojoy. Ufolojoy.com is our website. And ufolojoy.com is basically what deepspace90s.com was. It kind of transitioned into that.
Right.
And you know, Deep Space 90s, I think without that I wouldn't have ufology. Deep Space 90s kind of began as like an art project of mine. Um Probably like 5 years ago or so, where I was starting to kind of revisit these things in the 90s. And I was actually doing it through the lens of like Star Trek, which is why, it was Deep Space 90s, Space 90s. And I had this idea of like doing a zine where I was revisiting Star Trek, but like Star Trek took like Deep Space Nine took place instead of like in a promenade in the future on like the space station. It was like in a mall in the 90s. And I started doing all these illustrations and things. And I had this idea of like doing a zine and creating all these kind of, fake ads and fake products and things that were part of this universe. And then, as I started to explore my interest in, the paranormal again and get comfortable in that reality, it kind of like, that kind of took over completely. And that's kind of like what Ufology was born out of also, is just kind of drawing from a lot of things of the 90s and just getting really weird. Um, and
Amazing.
it's been a lot of fun, and we're working on the summer issue now that should come out, and the middle of July is our goal for that. It's going to be a quarterly magazine, and we're deep in issue 2 right now, having a lot of fun with that.
Fantastic. Oh, I can't wait to get that out. Oh, man. So everybody, ufolojoy.com. You can find the stuff there. Please order yourself a copy. I think it's wonderful. Just for the Charles Fort cartoon alone, like it's so good. I don't want to spill all of the contents because it's good to have surprises. But some of the directions that it goes is just so nice. It's just delicious. I cannot wait for issue 2. Brian, thank you so much for joining me here and talking about this weird decade. It was a
Mhm,
strange decade, and it's a decade that I think we're still kind of living in the shadow of it. Like
mhm,
we've kind of peered past the horrors and the war and the hatred of what occurred after 9/11. And while there's some things that particularly in America a lot of people are really upset about on whatever political side you want to say you're on, just people are not happy at each other. There's this other
mhm,
element where I think people have lost a lot of meaning in things, and they're looking at the weirdness and the strangeness to try and find that again. And I can only speak for myself. It kind of feels cool to be a part of whatever this current seems to be. And
mhm, for sure.
so happy to have found you, and I'm so happy that that you're surfing on the wave as well. It's going to be interesting times here, and let's definitely try to check in with you a little bit further on down the line about this. But I'm serious, everybody. Go grab yourself a copy of UFO Joy. It's wonderful. It's glorious. Yeah, and thank you and Virginia for doing it, and let's get it into some people's hands. So I hope that if some point in the future you'd come back on the show, you'd be happy to jump on and we'll talk about I don't know. I don't know if we can talk about another decade, but we'll talk about some other weird shit
Mhm.
if you're keen to.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. It was a pleasure being here. I've appreciated getting to know you this past year. It's weird. I got it. I think we started listening to your show during the pandemic, and um, you know, we've been listening ever since. And it's crazy to think that here I am now on the show. It's pretty
There you
wild to think about that, and it's kind of like the things that have been happening and the people we've been interacting with since we came out with this has been, pretty wild. It's been a really fun ride, and we're really excited, and we're very appreciative of your support and you being there for us and inspiring us along the way, and everyone else who's been so nice. It's been really awesome.
Fantastic. Oh, love to hear it. Let's keep a good thing going. All right, everybody. I have a few messages for you. Just following this, so there's gonna be a little bit of music, but be sure to listen to my announcement at the end of this episode, which includes the whole support me on Patreon spiel, but also some information as to what's happening for the podcast for the month of June of 2024. But that's the show. My goodness. Go watch yourself some X Files. Go listen to a few episodes of Art Bell and see what we're talking about, and leave expectations at the door. Just enjoy yourself. Have some fun. That's the other thing. I found the 90s pretty fun. Like we were talking about all this stuff. I found it pretty fun. From everything from like weird shithead conspiracy theories, as wild as they were, and probably as for damaging as some people took them very literally, I found the 90s pretty fun.
Mhm.
I was lucky that my parents had a bit of money. I wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but I was privileged enough to feel safe where I was.
Totally.
I had fun. The 90s
Mhm.
was a very fun period of time. Yeah,
Yeah.
and, while I wouldn't say I miss it, there was something happening. There was something in the water for a good 7 of those 10 years. There was something
Mhm.
really cool in the water. Alright, everybody. Brian, thank you again for joining me, and,
Thank you.
please, everybody, go grab a copy of You'll Follow Joy, and, I got some messages for you now, but we're gonna sign off, so, cue that shitty 90s infomercial music once again. But until the next time where I talk to each and every one of you, I want you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until then, ta-ta for now. And here are some messages from me once again. Bye-bye, everybody. Ta!
Bye.
All right, everybody, grab yourself a copy of You Follow Joy. Virginia and Brian have done some really great work with that, so please try and support if you can. Links in the show notes to this episode, and as well as the show notes of the stuff that we all talked about. There'll be some interesting ones, so please head to whatmagicisthis.com to grab those. All right, so there's going to be the usual that I'm going to do here for the end of every episode, and then there's going to just be a little bit of a small little outro here, just involving what's going to be happening with the podcast for a little bit. Why? Don't worry about it. The podcast is still going to go on, but I just have a couple of small little things to say. Anyhow, if you think that I'm doing something really good with the podcast and you'd like to show your support in some way, shape, or form, there's 3 ways of doing that. Let's go through them as we do every single time there's an episode of What Magic Is This? So the very first way of supporting me is via Patreon. It's only $7 a month. That's nothing. That is a potted plant. That is a new tablecloth. That is, I don't know, some spray for your glasses that cleans them? I really don't know. That might be actually cheaper, but maybe it's the good stuff. I don't know. $7 American, that's nothing. That's a fancy cocktail, is what I'm trying to say. And that goes to support me here at What Magic Is This, to keep me doing this podcasting thing. This podcast is my job. This is my life. I wake up and I work on it every day. Every single one of my guests who I've had on the show will say, "Man, you do a lot of work," and it really shows. And I say, "Yeah, I do. I spend hours researching and finding show notes and all of the best resources and pulling them down from my shelf. I do a lot of work. This is my job. And if you want to continue seeing it being my job, best way of supporting me is via the Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicis. This is like a whole different show. It's basically just me giving my insights onto certain entities, books of magic that I think everybody should read. I just did an episode about the Tua de Danann, and I had help from none other than Dara from the Spirit Box podcast. It was wonderful. I truly think that all of my best stuff is on the Patreon. I love what I do here with the main podcast, but I truly love and enjoy and put my heart and soul into making the Patreon episodes. So I would love to see you say the exact same thing and come and support me over on the Patreon. Lots of great things there. Access to a Discord community. It's just the best. I think it's my best work, and I would love for you to see it. And right now, there's about 350 people that are supporting me. I'd love to see more. And yes, you can join Patreon for free. You don't get all of the stuff if you were to support me, but right there, if you click on my Patreon, it'll be like, there's already Doug's got 600 people get paying him. I don't. I have just a little bit over half of that. Most of the people that are there are just free members who just want to follow what I do, because every once in a while I'll do an update as far as like what's going on in my life, and that's a great way of doing it. But if I would just really need to see your support to help me continue keeping this dream going. And the best way of doing that is through the Patreon. Again, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on any number of the support me on Patreon buttons. There's tons of them. Head there, please. Another way of supporting me is through PayPal. Head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on any number of the PayPal logos there. You can send me as much money as you want. You can send $1. You can send $200,000. I'll take either. All will be appreciated. That money that is given through the PayPal, it goes all straight back into paying for all of the fees that I have for this podcast. Things are expensive. I literally just recently dropped about $300 on one of these subscription things that I use for my podcast. It's never ending. I spend hundreds of dollars on the podcast every month, and that comes straight out of my pocket. But if you donate through PayPal, that's where that money goes. Just keeping the fires on here at What Magic Is This? It keeps, let's go with the hamster analogy. It keeps the hamster on the hamster wheel that runs, that keeps the podcast going. Yeah, it's the cream in the coffee. No, wait, that's not a good. Anyways, if you donate through PayPal, that goes straight back into helping the podcast. All donations are appreciated. If you do not like the whole paying me $7 a month kind of thing, then there's another option for that. The last way of supporting my show is via purchasing some of my merchandise. So head to whatmagicisthis.com, go to the menu, click on the merch button there, and you can buy t-shirts, mugs. I'm having quite a few people buying stuff these days, which is really good to see. I don't see a ton of money from these purchases, but I do love seeing people wearing my stuff. It's really cool. If you do indeed buy a t-shirt, please send me a picture of yourself wearing it. I love to see them. And let's start a contest. Let's start a contest over the next 6 months. I'm going to mention it in each one of the episodes until the end of the year, basically, with Doug's merchandise taken in the most crazy place. Let's just say that. Let's keep it nice and broad. I want to see you wearing my thing at a cool place, cool, interesting place. I mean, if you show it in space, that'd be wicked. That would definitely win. And not like a Photoshop job. No Photoshop, no AI is all I'm going to say. But anyway, there's a challenge. I'll bring you on the podcast, right? If whoever has the craziest merchandise photograph, let's have some fun, right? But yes, I don't see a ton of money from those merch purchases, but I do love to see them. There's mugs, t-shirts, stickers, fridge magnets, tote bags, wall hangings, hoodies, iPhone cases, laptop bags, so many cool things. It's really quite wonderful. So again, head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the merch button in the menu there, and grab yourself some swag, some What Magic Is This swag. So when you walk down the street, people will be like, hey, what magic is this? You'll say, it's a podcast. You should listen to it. They spent 2.5 hours talking about the 90s. We did, specifically for this episode you're listening to now. But of course, the place where I would love to see you the most would be the Patreon. Again, $7 American. That's it. That's all. So much other stuff. You get a whole other podcast. And that's great because if you haven't joined the podcast and you want to get some more stuff, because truthfully, I'm going to talk about why there's not going to be a lot of What Magic Is This over the next 30 days or so. But I'll talk about that just a moment here. But I would love to see you on the Patreon, patreon.com/What Magic Is This. All right, so you heard at the beginning of the episode, I'm going to be doing something at Treadwell's on the 20th of June, 2024. That's awesome. That's all well and good. I wanted to make a small little announcement here that on the 10th of June, and I did mention it earlier in the episode, so I'm going to mention it again. On the 10th of June, that's my 5-year anniversary for What Magic Is This? I uploaded my very first episode with my friend Andre talking about Discordianism. That was half a decade ago. My goodness, time flies. And part of me was like, I should do a special episode. I was going to do an episode about Discordianism again, and that just kind of fell through the cracks of my hands. And then I was just like, you know what? You got to take care of yourself, Douglas. So unfortunately for everybody, there's only going to be one episode released in all of June, and that's going to be this one. And I know it's kind of like maybe a little bit out of left field, like Doug's talking about the 90s. All right. But I hope you found something enjoyable about this episode. The 5-year anniversary, I'm going to treat myself. And by doing that, I'm going to be going on a vacation. It's my first vacation since 2019, my first true vacation since 2019, since this podcast has started. There's been a lot of stuff happening in the world, some global, some local, but Doug needs some time away from the podcast. And so I'm actually just going to take the time away. I will be producing stuff for the Patreon over June. So 1 or 2 things going to be happening there while I am on the road. Should be nice, well, and good. But if you want more What Magic Is This, truly, just join the Patreon. There's so much content there. There's so many of my offerings. It really is a whole different podcast. I guarantee you'll love it. I do so many crazy cool things there. So even if just you want to join for 1 or 2 months, I'd hope you'd stay for longer. But yes, only going to be one podcast released this month. This is the one. And then I return in July with a firecracker of an episode. Trust me, if everything goes according to plan, you are going to love the episode. You're going to love the guest that I have for the show in July. So that's all I wanted to say. 5 years, it has been a hell of a ride. Oh my goodness. I never expected my podcast to be anything more than just a hobby for myself while I worked, doing a 9 to 5 kind of thing. And a lot of times it would be like a 9 to 9 kind of thing. I was overworking. I was a little bit bored when I had time off. So I just started a podcast and wanted to see where it went. And I'd love to say that it all came from inside my head right away. I had an idea as to how the whole thing was going to go. I didn't. I had a couple of influences, and then those influences came to the foray. And in that 5 years, my podcast has turned into something that more than 1.5 million people have tuned into my show. It's really crazy. And I mean, we just talked about Art Bell. He had huge numbers as well, but everything starts small. And this podcast has been a gift. It has been my entire life. And I am so thankful that this is what I do for a living. And I'm thankful for you for listening and for tuning in and for liking the show and for telling your friends about it and just being part of the community. And even if you don't subscribe to the Patreon, I still consider you a friend just for tuning in and listening the way that you do. And that is amazing that the person that really had no idea that this would go anywhere besides maybe, I don't know, 50 people listening every month, that's just where it would start and end. And I'd just be talking to friends that I had about my weird obsession, and that's where it would have been to now where, I have people I would never have guessed reaching out to me and telling me that they love my podcast. I've met some very interesting people. I've made some very brilliant friends. My life has been changed because of this thing. And in a small way, it was an act of magic. And I'm so thankful that each and every one of you can see where it's gone. And I'm really hoping that it continues for another 5 years. And, I can't do that without you listening. So I just want to say thank you so much for being my friends and for listening to the What Magic Is This podcast. It means the world to me. And I'm so glad that you would like it as much as you do. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So with that, I am going to throw down a smoke bomb. Poof. And I am going to enjoy myself on a small little vacation. We will see each and every one of you in early July. But until then, I'm just really going to enjoy myself and get some time away and to myself and with my beautiful girlfriend. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Here's to 5 years. Cheers, cheers. Here's to 5 years of being luminous. Ta for now. And let's have a little bit more of this music. I can't get enough of this song. So here you go, everybody. The best. No, but seriously, like this kind of music was around so much. And if you weren't raised in the 90s, you have no idea. But yeah, this was like this kind of shit that is playing right now. It was ubiquitous. What times we lived in. Goodbye.